All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. I am extremely humbled, grateful, honored, and excited to have with us today Vita Austin, who has been in the field, if I'm not mistaken, of water research and crystallography for 9 years, if that's correct.
Hmm.
And also, you have your own unique short term freezing technique as well, amongst many other things that is just mind blowing with respects to just so many people, even in the the UFO community, if I may say. They always talk about how, oh, they've been told things off the record and it's right under our noses, it's right in front of our faces. And I cannot help but think that Vita's work is a vast contributor to that. So without further ado, how are you today, Vita? Thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm doing great. And I'm excited to share some things that I don't usually share in my podcast simply because I don't get asked. So I'm very happy to start just maybe with a little bit of a presentation. Uh, Anyone can go and see my work if they're curious to know what I do, but to do a very short little intro about what it is I do, I am basically freezing water after it's been influenced through my thoughts or various words or music or all kinds of different things like that. And then when I take my petri dish out, I use a specific technique. I'll explain that soon. And I photograph the crystallography that is on the ice. And what I see are images that are recognizable and relevant to the influence. For example, I can think of my hand and project that thought into the water and photograph a hand in the ice, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. So I'm going to head and screen share. Okay. So, sorry.
Yeah, and to add on, Vita, I believe that you said that you continued the work of Dr. Emoto.
Well, no, I mean, I hadn't actually met Emoto myself, but what I was saying prior was that my work really kind of springboarded from that opening. He opened the doorway for people to start to see themselves as bodies of water. And he showed that water is responsive to consciousness. What I'm suggesting is that it's much more than that. And my work is macroscopic. I take all my photos on my iPhone, so they're actually huge in comparison to the microscopic work that he did. So this is a really big question that is very much up to debate as to where water came from. So some people in the science community believe that it came from asteroids and meteorites, and some people believe that it actually is held in the ringwoodite, in this kind of primary layer of the Earth's mantle. Either way, both of these areas are places that people have never been, essentially kind of making water an alien substance. By molecular count, we're 99% water, and we can't live without it. And when we look for life on other planets, we're always looking for water, but we never want to call it alive. So I'm going to talk on that. So if this alien substance that is water could communicate with you, what if it could read your mind and show you thoughts through the method of freezing? So just for people that don't know Emoto's work, I'm just sharing some of my influences, the people that actually inspired me. But his work was very much in contrast. So I am very interested in the subtleties in between the extremes. This man is much less known. He's actually become a very good friend of mine. His name is Laurent Costa. He, similar to Emoto, is taking microscopic photographs of water. But what he holds dear to him is an ethos of which I also value. He does not want to experiment on water, and neither do I. My work has never come from a place of experimentation, because I'm a body of water that doesn't want to be experimented on, and because water is responsive and I actually see it as a living being, and only in a different type of way. It is not in a body. So it is like fluid consciousness. And perhaps consciousness and water work together, like salt in the sea. And so what he saw were these hearts and faces, and he would simply invite water to share whatever it wanted. He didn't want to control water. And so the faces that he saw microscopically were actually reflecting the smiles that he gave to water. And when I see these, they make me feel happy. And so I worked professionally as an oil painter for many years, and I see the world through an artistic lens. So rather than seeing geometries, when you see faces and pictures, this brings about a different feeling. And so very much like the new age of hieroglyphs, actually emojis are ways in which we can read symbols. So when somebody writes us a message and says, "Hi, I'm going to meet you at so-and-so," and gives you a kissy face and a heart at the end, you actually read the kissy face and the heart. You understand the energy of that person coming from those emojis. So we understand that people can also read symbols, and we do that. So this man here is also not so well known, but his name was Thomas Hieronymus. And he was a radionic engineer, and he observed something very interesting. He observed that when he went into a Parisian meat market, the freshly placed organs of an animal appeared to be affecting the way the frost froze on the glass behind where they were placed. For example, the frost would freeze in the shape of a liver above a liver organ, and so on and so on. And that was very encouraging to me because he was seeing these with his naked eye, and all my work is macroscopic. And so what he thought, his hypothesis, was that perhaps there was some kind of life force energy emanating out of these organs, even though they were no longer attached to an animal, because there was water still in the blood, and the water was communicating within the water in the air, and that was affecting the way the frost froze. And even Rudolf Steiner suggests to his students to observe the patterns that form in the frost on a butcher's window compared to that of a florist's. So this is the very first photograph I ever took. I was very curious to find out for myself if water stored information. And so I took those people's work and information, very open-mindedly. But I really am of the opinion that people should find things out for themselves and try things out for themselves if you can. So back then I didn't have a microscope, but I had some incredible water that had helped to heal me. And I had a petri dish. So my thought was that I would project a thought into the petri dish of water and freeze it, because all three of those examples of people that I just gave, the expression was shown in the frost, in the freezing, in the ice. And so I knew I had to freeze something to turn the invisible into the visible. And so basically there was a bit of fluff floating around in the petri dish. So I put my hand in to take the fluff out, and I consciously thought, oh, I wonder if my hand will have any impact on the water's quote-unquote memory, because I really didn't know if it was true. So I left it in the freezer for some time, pulled it out, held it up to the light, and took this photo on my iPhone. And honestly, I was kind of freaked out because I wasn't expecting to see it. It took up half of the petri dish, which is quite large. And so I showed my son and I said, hey Rama, what does this look like to you? And he didn't know what I'd done. And he said, looks like a hand, Mum. Looks kind of like an x-ray of a hand. And I'm like, I know, it really does. And so then I went to the ocean, and because I thought, well, if any water's going to be informed, it's got to be seawater. And I just froze a little bit of that seawater, and I got a fish with a perfectly round eye, and its body and its fins, and it's more feathery because seawater freezes differently than fresh water. So then I thought, well, water really loves to design an imagery. So some of these photos you'll see are more recent in that I'm using my new technique. In the very beginning, I used to completely freeze water because I didn't know any better. And over the course of these 9 years, I discovered a lot more about the new science of water, about this fourth phase of water, the stage between liquid and ice, and where it's more of a gel, it's more kind of a plasma, it's the kind of water that is actually in our cells fourth phase water has a slightly more, it has a negative charge, it absorbs more light, it's more viscous, and it works kind of like a battery, and it expands with infrared light. So I wanted to see what I was missing. So I started opening my freezer earlier and earlier and earlier to see what stage of freezing the water was at. And I discovered that when you freeze water for just under 5 minutes, and it depends on each person's freezer setting, it does vary, the water splits into two types of water that I call informed and uninformed. Essentially, one is frozen, one is still liquid. So what I want to do is capture the first freeze, because as water freezes, it freezes in layers. And when I do workshops, I always over-freeze one to show people how many layers there are to crack through to get to the first freeze. And so I discovered that just like with a glue and glitter picture from when you're a child, you might have done this, where you're given a piece of paper and a glue stick and you draw something with the glue stick, you put glitter all over it, and then you tip it up and shake it, and there's the glittery picture. So your thoughts, your conscious expression is much like the glue, and the water that's attracted to that conscious expression forms the image and it sticks to the conscious expression. And the liquid water that's left over is tipped away. So essentially I tip the liquid water away and I photograph the first freeze, and that has left me with a much more clear three-dimensional imagery. And so when I look back at my old work, it's really remarkable to me that I have got such incredible pictures, given that this technique now shows me such incredible work. So I saw that water likes to design, so I started using pictures of people. And this is my friend Wendy, and I used her photo. So essentially I put my petri dish on top of her photograph for 30 seconds. I like the number 30 seconds. There's no specific reason for it. It doesn't have to be anywhere near that long. Sometimes I just wave it over a picture and put it into the freezer, use my technique, and it still works. As your relationship with water develops, you start to realize that water already knows what you're going to do before you even do it. So this is about relationship, though. It is very important to understand that, and I want to talk about that after I've shown some of this work. And if I haven't done that, please remind me. So this was the image that appeared after using Wendy's face, and I have lots of different pictures now of different people's faces, and the water shows their crystallography and their features. What I have observed is that as water begins to freeze in the very, very early stages, what you might observe is that there is a kind of halo or aura around that chute. Now that's a very special picture that I've captured here, because I think water uses light to help it design. So this is something of which is very much in alignment with an Indigenous woman who told me that she could speak to bees and trees. They just happen to rhyme. And she said that she was watching a hive for a long time. And this bee actually told her in its own way, listen, we don't mind you watching our hive, but please don't watch it for too long, because your conscious expression is putting too much light into our hive, and we need it to be dimmer. And that really made me think, well, our conscious expression, when it's focused on something, is giving light to that thing. So within this realm of water, actually what appears to happen is, through this conscious interaction, not only am I giving the water more light to design, but it is probably also giving me more light. There is this reciprocal relationship that happens when you go into right relationship with nature. So here are just a few examples of some of my work. Like I said, I have thousands, but I don't have time to show you them all. So what you might like to know a little bit about a couple of them. So the top right, the baby, I asked a woman who was pregnant to sip some water, thinking of her child. And she was in the very early stages of her pregnancy. And so then I took the leftover water and I froze it. And you can see how much it looks like an embryo at the stage that she was pregnant. Below that, there is what almost looks like an etching of a Schnauzer dog. So this is a kind of funny story. I went into a cafe and I saw this cute dog drinking from a bowl that they leave out for thirsty dogs. And so I said to the waitress, look, this might be the weirdest thing anybody has ever asked you, but can you please give me a takeaway cup so I can take some of that dog water home to freeze? And so she kindly let me, and I simply came home, put the water in the petri dish and froze it using my technique, and the Schnauzer dog's impression is clearly there. Here are some more. Some of them are fairly obvious as to what I've done. The eye one is kind of cool. So one thing I guess you'll know about me is that there's nearly always a petri dish of water somewhere in my near vicinity. And so I was cutting onions and tears were coming out of my eyes. So I must have looked really weird doing it, but I just got my petri dish of water and just scooped some of those tears and they went into the water. And when I froze it, you can see that the iris has appeared. Now I'm going to address the fact that you see different colors coming through the pictures. That is because the ice is very thin and it picks up on whatever is in the background. I like that because it's almost like water and light play together to create like this beautiful artistic expression. But some people don't like that, and so I openly share and teach my technique, and many people have tried it in all different kinds of ways, but it's nice to understand why there are different colors. Over here we just have more examples of water responding to imagery. And this is kind of cool. Now, there's an interesting story behind all of them. But with the pig, what I had done was actually show the water. And when I say show, I know I use a lot of terms that seem like they're very human, like I'm talking about a person. But we are a body of water. We never see ourselves that way. But if you actually think about it, we see everything through water, because our eye lens is 99% water. Someone once said to me, what if water is expressing its consciousness through every living being on this planet so that it can observe itself from every different perspective, which was a very interesting idea. Now, if you think about it, water has been in the clouds, it's been in the trees, it's been in all of the animals, the insects, the creatures, the mammals, like everything. It's also something of which none of us can live without. And even when it comes to procreation, we are actually held in this amniotic fluid. When we are conceived, we're conceived through fluids. And there's this exchange, this information that is also shared. I've done studies of egg albumin, which is the closest to amniotic fluid that I could get, and I've seen remarkable results, which we can talk about later. But when we come back to the pig, I left a petri dish of water sitting beside my computer as I watched a YouTube video that someone had sent me. It was of a pig escaping from a truck that was being taken to the abattoir, and the pig survived, and it got looked after by some lovely people. But what you see in this picture is at the top you see the picture of a pig, but if you look below it, although I haven't outlined it in this one, you can make out that there's a second pig. Now what's very interesting is that water shows us that it saw more than we did in the video. I suspect the second pig was trying to jump after the first one, and this is not the first time that I've seen this. I've seen examples of water seeing things that we can't multiple times. Some more images. The top one, I basically just put the petri dish of water in front of the Batman, the Dark Knight movie, and that I left it alone to watch the movie, and it designed the image of Batman.
Sorry, Vita, I do not mean to interrupt your presentation. Actually, that's the Batman picture there actually sort of answers my question, because I was going to ask, not in a bad faith way or anything like this, but was there ever any tests that you did, if you will, maybe I shouldn't call it that, but or observations where something did not return in that parallel representation in the water? But I'm asking that because not so much about your work in particular, but maybe that speaks to the object in which the water is observing, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I definitely will cover that. So that happens a lot in the area of words. So water doesn't read words, water reads the energy of a word, which is why it understands all different languages and symbols. Now, I'm going to get into that, but there have been times where water has shown me something completely different to what I expected. And one of the biggest things you do wrong in this work is expect water to do something. Water is wild. We want to keep it wild. When you form a relationship, you don't get into a relationship to control. You get into a relationship to actually learn and care and love. This is one of the reasons I don't like the word experiment. It's not this kind, nice thing to do, to get straight into a relationship. Right, let's experiment on you, see what's going to happen. So what I would say is an example of that would be, well, God, there's actually quite a number of them, where there is the sound of Om. So I've used lots of different music and sounds, and the sound of Om tends to form, because I've done a lot of repeat studies, over and over, it will form these rings that look a lot like rings in a tree trunk. So I assumed, which is very bad on my part, that water would show something similar to the sound of a gong, because there's kind of a similar vibe about that. My issue with me, always the issue was the person. And so what water showed me was not anything like the rings that I expected. It showed me the actual gong with a mallet on top. It designed the instrument instead. And if I am in my arrogance or in my frustration, which I'm happy to say doesn't happen very often, but I have got 3 children, so, frustration can happen and traffic happens and things. So if I'm stupid enough to come back and home and think, oh, great, let's do some crystallography now, water will not design with me. It won't work. So it holds a frequency. It's not in judgment ever. Water I think of as the observer, which is why we can observe ourselves, which is why we can astral travel, which is why when you have a near-death experience you become the observer. And I can explain that later because I think that's very, very interesting. But when you come into the space, water isn't judging. Water simply doesn't resonate at a lower frequency. That's it.
So Vita, with that Batman, for example,
yeah.
is the water taking the shape of the poster's energy, or is it taking shape of your perception of the poster's energy?
That's a good question. So I just showed the poster because that was to explain that it actually saw the movie. And I left the room. So I myself haven't actually even seen that movie. I left it there and left. So with a lot of this work, I know that I have a conscious relationship with water. I try to leave the room, come back and do the crystallography.
Because by definition, your relationship would affect the result, and that's not what you want in that case.
Yes and no. Yes and no. I've asked water questions I have no answer for and got responses. So I have so much that I could share. I hope that I'm able to share as much as I can in this area.
Sorry, please carry on. Didn't mean to interrupt.
No. I love your questions. Are so good. So this is really interesting, and my daughter has done a lot of this work. So she's obsessed with like unicorns and fairies and things, and so she wrote the word unicorn, and you can see that she got this beautiful unicorn that looks like it's kind of in this frozen wonderland. That's the top left. The ghost spirit face is really interesting because it looks liquid, but actually all the way around it is this more solid looking ice. But the actual thing, that the face that looks liquid, was actually not liquid. It's just more of a gel type of the ice. It was very bizarre. And that was actually from asking the water to connect to someone who had passed. So the word angel, and you see this angel kind of appear. And my daughter, she wrote unicorn horn. And so she got lots and lots of what actually, the backed out image is amazing, where it looks like there's a lot of spirals, all just spiraling up like spiraled horns. So you can see water understands anatomy. The interesting story about the skull is that I was just talking about these giant skeletons that have been found around the world, and why doesn't anyone really talk about this? And you know, and so as I was talking about that, I wasn't even consciously really trying to influence the water. The petri dish was there, and very, very often I don't influence the water. I don't interact with the water. I don't even like the word influence. It's so hard to know what words to use that don't sound controlling. But it's for people to understand what I mean, I guess. So I had been simply talking, and the last thing I talked about was around these giant skeletons, and this was the image that I got. The foot is when I put my foot into some water and froze that. The hair braid is quite exceptional. I had a photograph of my daughter's braid, and the image, it's really, I mean, I'm an artist, and even to paint a braid is not easy. To see something like this is really quite remarkable. And even in the thumb picture, I put my thumb into the water and took it out and froze it. You can see there's a little nick, like round circle on the edge of the nail. And so when I took that, I noticed that, and then just an hour or so later, I actually did something to my nail where it cut in exactly that place. It kind of broke in this kind of weird way. And so it was as if water was showing me something that was about to happen to my thumb, which I've seen also multiple times. So this was a cool story. Another pregnant woman, she basically she drank some water and thought of her child, and the next day she was going for an ultrasound, and she showed me the photo. So we get into some interesting stuff here about pyramids and aliens. So I've seen multiple pyramids, and some really interesting stuff has happened. I also had a wellness center, which I'll let you know about, that quite some years ago. And I actually worked within a pyramid structure. I had a wooden pyramid large enough to put 8 people lying down in, and it was just the kind of legs, and it was a fascinating tool of geometry, and some crazy stuff happened in that pyramid, and it was one of the first things that got me into water. I actually I wanted to see if there would be a difference in dissolved oxygen. So I got my water from my tap in the house, and my wellness center was right beside the house. I got 2 glasses of water, tested them both for dissolved oxygen. It was like 4 out of 12 parts per million. Then I took one of them, and I took it and I put it inside the pyramid on this little stool. So it was around about where the king's chamber would be. And the first thing you start to notice is all of these bubbles starting to form. But then about an hour afterwards, I tested it for dissolved oxygen, and it was 11 out of 12 parts per million. And that then made me realize how come people were healing so well in these pyramids, that the work that I was doing, because it was helping to oxygenate their blood. But it was doing much more, what I recognized was that actually when someone was finished in the pyramid, when the treatment was ready and done, like finished for them, this very, very cold feeling would come over all of us, so cold that we started to shake and that we would have to put blankets around, I'd have to put blankets around people. And so it was a very, very interesting thing, and remind me to tell you of what happened to one man one day in that pyramid, because it's a crazy fun story. So this is just an example of where I put a amethyst pyramid into some water, and you can see that it's designed the pyramid. Now, hopefully you can hear this. Can you hear it?
Unfortunately, I don't think so.
Okay, I'm going to explain. So basically, what you're seeing here is that I've put this pyramid into some seawater. My idea was that I was simply going to, my intention was to leave the pyramid there for a short time and take it out like that, and then freeze the influenced seawater. I'm saying I can consider the quartz crystal pyramid to be an influencer, and it's transferring information into the water. That was my intention, but that didn't happen. So then 2.5 weeks later, all the water had evaporated, and I'd left it on the bench. So what's interesting is that when you look closely, they're all in pyramid shapes. Salt doesn't normally do that. It normally freezes, is in cubic structures. Because the nature of salt is cubic. So for the salt crystals to have formed structurally in pyramids, it's very unusual. So I'm trying to listen to what it's saying and say what I'm saying. It could be through a type of piezoelectricity that was shared from the crystal into the water, but it's informed the seawater, and it's also informed electrical water, because salt has electrical charge and the crystal has piezoelectricity, and all electricity, all together, there's a lot of information that was shared. So once evaporated, the information was clearly transferred to such a high level that it changed the structural integrity information of the salt. So,
and this was filmed with an iPhone, just to confirm?
Yeah,
wow.
That was on my iPhone. So this is just a comparison of water that had the influence of the pyramid compared to with none. So you can see that it's very different. This is just cool. Obviously, I'm from New Zealand. I'm out in the States at the moment, but there is this place in the Chatham Islands called Pyramid Island. And what's curious and interesting about that, because my father is pretty well known in New Zealand by a lot of people because for all his fishing shows, and he's this amazing Maori guy called Bill Hohepa, and so he observed that the sick or injured fish and dolphins and sea life go and they live under the pyramid to heal. So it suggests that there is this healing property that animals respond to and go to and seek out. So this is kind of cool. My son really loves Indiana Jones, and he watched the one with the crystal skulls, and so he said, "Oh, we should think about a crystal skull, Mum," and that's what we did. We thought about the crystal skulls, and then we saw the image on the right, and I've given an example of what a crystal skull looks like for anyone who wants to see that. I wrote the word alien on a piece of paper, and this is the image that I saw. It's very interesting and kind of very similar to the long Egyptian heads that we've seen. This is interesting. I also wrote alien on it. I've done a lot of words for alien, which are subjective because that can mean a lot of things for a lot of different people. And so one of the interesting things is that I don't see the same thing all the time for that word. I see a lot of different variations. This was a very interesting thing I asked water. I said, what is your earliest memory? It was for, now bearing in mind that each water source may have come from different places. So it might have been the earliest memory for that particular water source. And so I just found that very interesting because that is definitely not what I expected to see. Again, I have to get rid of my expectations. But I thought water might show me something more universal. I was very surprised to see a face.
Just curious, Vita, before you go on, when you had said the word alien in the previous slide, do you think, in your humble opinion, that's a very great point? Different, I guess you could say, pockets of water are I guess manifested at different times throughout the universe at different points and all of this. But when you think of alien, whether you have an image in your mind or not of what you personally perceive to be a non-human entity, if you will, do you think the water is telling you, based on that particular pocket of water's understanding or blueprint of that word, or do you think your intent as you say it is also helping to form it too, or a little bit of both?
Well, you have to then question what's my view on aliens to understand that question better. And I have a very, very interesting, interesting story and very open mind. I haven't got a specific view on how I view aliens. We're bombarded with what to think. We're taught what to think all the time. And one of the things that I've been very much mindful of in this work is to actually remain as neutral as we can. And obviously that's very difficult because you get to a certain, well, from the moment we're born, we're being taught what to think.
Right.
But I don't have a specific view on what aliens may look like. I think we're very likely the aliens. We don't even know where water came from.
Right.
So I'm always surprised as to what I see.
Sorry, before you go on, if I were to do this experiment as well and compare to you, so if I thought of the word alien and then did this and then you thought of it, do you think we would be receiving different results based on a multitude of factors? What body of water it came from, what the intent was, what you were feeling when you made that thought? Do you think there's varying factors that fluctuate?
Yes, yes. And at the same time, it is highly possible to actually see very similar pictures. I have done exactly that, where I have simultaneously thought with another person from another country about a certain thing, and we've got very, very similar results. But you have to be connected to that person. There is a relationship. That's why I keep talking about that. But the point I think you were also making was, and I have mentioned this, if, and again we don't know,
right,
but if water did actually seed the planet, or at least part of the planet, from meteorites and asteroids, they would have probably come from different places, therefore creating different energetics around the world. So there are definitely some places around the world where water is what I would term a medicine. This has medicinal value. Whereas there are some waters which just seem to have bad luck in that they are prone to being polluted. They just are not respected. They're in areas where their headwaters are maybe diverted and they are being manipulated in various different ways. And there are energetic areas all around the world, and different people gravitate to these different places. So it is said that the water that is often some of the best water for you is right the nearest body of water to where you were born. And that's always very interesting, so because the Andeans believe that we have four parents, our mother, our father, and our father mountain, and our mother water. And we need to respect those places from where we were born, our nearest mountain and our nearest water source. And so it is extremely interesting as we kind of go through this work, because I do think that certain places hold certain energies, and water is coming up through the ground. And so that's another part. It's like if water is actually, it has been emanating up through the ground and has more come out through fissures and through earthquakes and various different ways in which can like shape water up and out of the ground through springs and sources like that and aquifers, then it has also been in contact with the earth and the womb of the earth. And so we kind of think about that, and then you think about all the water also evaporates. So there would have been a point where a lot of this liquid water has evaporated and come into this cycle of life. And so we see water reincarnate in front of us all of the time, going from a liquid to a gas, and then raining back down, or maybe coming in snow and then going into the ocean. So it's very difficult to know exactly what water is mixed with what water. It would be very interesting to see if certain places actually pull their same water sources back towards them through clouds. I'd be very curious about that, but I don't know anyone that's studying about that, and so I just thought that actually just then.
Right. And if I may ask, sorry, one last thing. If, in your opinion, do you think, I was really struck by what you said about being born, or the body of water closest to where you were born as an infant, as a baby, is the strongest, I guess, relationship, if I'm not mistaken, that you would have with it. I wonder, not really, I guess I'm just putting this thought out there, if one would get more accurate, quote unquote, accurate, harmonic, more consciously oriented results if they were to return back to the body of water closest to their birthplace?
I think they definitely would, and I would suggest that they think of it almost like a pilgrimage, going back to source. Because I don't think of water as a resource, I think of it as source. And these things we tend not to even think about. We don't think about our relationship with nature very often. And I think it's some of the things that we're missing. We're missing out on so much.
Right. Thank you so much.
No problem. This was just a bizarre one. This was when I was still totally freezing water. You can definitely see the difference in the way that the freezing looks. But it was taken like a second apart. And so I can't take a lot of photos, mainly because ice melts fast using my new technique. But I would normally take between 1 and 3 to 4 photographs per dish. And just this face started to kind of appear. It just seemed so interesting. It was like this little person peeking his arm around and with his little eyes, like having a look. It was just a very interesting observation from quite some years ago. So I said to water, and I do just ask questions, show me life on another planet. And so it kind of looks like another planet with potentially 2 suns or a moon, or I don't really know what the other things are there, but it's just a very interesting answer to my question, of which, again, actually I don't know what that might look like. I've actually become pretty good at, I've accepted that water is my teacher, and in that aspect, I don't feel like I know more than it does. And in that aspect too, I recognize that I'm also the teacher, because we're bodies of water and we've forgotten. We've just forgotten. But we can remember. Here's the point. If we look back at our entire life, everything, every single thing we think about is a memory. Our entire life is a memory. So water science will say that water can store information. I think it's because of the salt in our body that, as well as the water, because salt is a crystal and crystals store vast amounts of information. salt is such an interesting thing when you think about how it has that electrical charge, but it can like disappear and suddenly it doesn't look like it's there, but you can taste it, and when water evaporates, it's still there. We're made of these two sort of immortals because you can't kill water, it simply evaporates. And even after cremation, the ashes that you have are actually salts. Again, you're not killing salt either. But together, it's like they work in this beautiful marriage. And I think that one of the reasons we're able to have cellular memory is based on the water and salt in our body. I asked to show what Mars looks like, whether or not that's actually Mars, who knows. But I got that from something on the internet because I just thought, oh, let's go and see if it looks anything like what I've got here. And it was interesting. But I asked water to show me something on Earth that was inspired by aliens. And it was a pretty powerful image and looks very similar to the Mayan pyramid. And what's interesting, and that particular pyramid was known for its ancient astronauts. So it was pretty interesting.
And Vida, the slide where you asked to show the earliest memory, that to me looked like the Easter Island heads.
Yes.
And I've explored what the Easter Island heads could have been, and you know, this ancient civilization. So that's really fascinating. Have you drawn parallels to what you're doing here with water and with what goes on in Ouija boards, where you're asking a question out into like the ether, the cosmos, and you're basically being guided to receive an answer?
I haven't made that association personally. For me, because, and I will go into the spirit world because I have asked questions around that. For me, well, the answer is no, I haven't thought about that. I just think I'll keep it as simple as that. So for this one, it's interesting because the pyramid that I was shown, because I think for this one I had written the word pyramid, and it showed me this pyramid, but it's got that circle in the middle of it, which I find really interesting.
Could that be where, are you going to be exploring what that circle could mean?
Well, I've got this thing called HYDROglyphs. So what I'm going to show you some of that, and that stamped circle is actually a hydroglyph, and so we're going to see what that may mean as we go along. It's interesting that you would see it in a pyramid though. So I wrote the word artificial intelligence, and I've always loved this picture because when you consider this as liquid water going in and this is imagery coming out, for me this is very artificial looking. It looks like wires. There is some technology going on there. There's a lot to see in this picture. And so water is, I mean, I couldn't have never have even thought that it would design something like this. So it's very, very curious to me. And although I took this photo some years ago, it never ceases to amaze me. And I haven't shared it on a podcast in the last year. So it's nice to see it again, although it's definitely curious. So animals are often very, very attracted to water. They seem to be able to see things in water that we cannot see. When I was living back in New Zealand, my cat Jiva, I would put petri dishes of water on the floor just to see what he would do. And for this particular time, he kept fishing out. He's trying to fish something out. He could see something in there that I just couldn't see. And the water captured his paw. But what I've observed him do is just stare at the water for a long time, just like he's looking, and he'll move his head like he's looking at something. And it's interesting because it's usually not in an area where there's too much reflection. I kind of thought, well, maybe he's looking at the clouds going by. Maybe we move it here and we move it here. So I moved it into my bedroom where there was not a lot of reflective light, and he still did it. He just could see things, but I couldn't.
If I may ask, Vita, I have a family friend, but I'm on the other side of Canada right now, but I was initially raised in Toronto. And this family friend, it's very interesting that you brought this up, particularly these photos, because whether we want to call it coincidences or synchronicities and all of that, just last week, I was speaking to this family friend who I hadn't spoken to in maybe 3, 4 years at this point, and he said to me, Dave, I moved into my girlfriend's house, and her cat is one of the nicest cats I've ever, met or anything like that. But since I've moved in, the cat really loves me and will only drink from my cup of water and refuses to drink from its own bowl of water. And I do have to say, this family friend, he's a very, very positive person. I wonder if there's some type of, again, with having to do with information structures and memories, and even just the conscious maybe harmonics disseminating from the water, if that makes sense. Does that resonate with you at all?
I'm smiling because it reminds me of a story that I also have where I had a friend who had bought a cat from a new cat, and she was only able to let it would only want to drink this cat milk that she would buy.
Right.
She said, "Oh, it just won't drink water." I'm like, "That's not very cat-like. Cats love to drink water. That seems strange." She said, "No, look." So she'd put water in, and it would just ignore it. And so I'm like, "Oh, let me try." And so I had bought my bottle of water. I put some of my water into the petri dish, into the cat bowl, and it was right, and her bowl of milk was still there, which it normally would go for, and it went and it drank my water. So animals are so perceptive, and they can see things we can't see. Another friend I'd say, "What's your dog doing?" And his dog would just sit and just stare at the wall, and its head would just move. He said it always does that. She always does that. I don't really understand. And it's like they are watching things that we cannot see. And so I want to share a story with you. Not that I'm all that comfortable still with sharing it. So when I come off the presentation, I'm happy to talk about it. But it is in relation to that very thing, a thing that actually happened to me because I was born with very different eye lenses. And I had surgery twice to have them removed. But when I had them, I could see the world without the veil. And so we can get into that a little bit. So let me go into here. So this story is very important. So I asked, "Can you connect to my mum?" So that's a picture of me and my mum. So my mum passed away in 1999, and we used to write letters to each other when I lived in Japan, before cell phones and computers and all that. And at the end of every letter, my mother would attempt to draw a circle. They were always terrible. My mother would be the first to admit it, and they looked like misshapen rotis, and she'd draw a heart in the middle. And when I saw this image appear after asking that question, it really meant a lot to me. And now every year on her birthday, I ask the same question, and I get the same response. So it suggests that these different realms that we talk about, even the idea of a veil is like a very thin mist. It is this idea that water and the conscious expression that we have as who we are, they work in unison. I've always thought this, that I think we have these kind of two types of water within us. Just like I see two types of water in my petri dish, the informed and uninformed water, I also see two types of water in albumin, egg albumin, the gloopy gelatinous part, and then a thinner type which is more like saliva, which is where I do my crystallography. And in Maori, in my culture, my father is Maori, the word for spirit is wairua, which wai means water and rua means two waters. And so this two water thing has been following me for many years. So there is the concept that we are a conscious drop. That actually within this container, this human-shaped container, is two things: is the moving tributaries, the water that hydrates us, that fills us, but then there is also like this drop of consciousness that essentially is the essence of the life we have. And so I've always thought that that conscious expression, that special type of concentrated, either it's a water or a gas, and this ties then into the idea that water is the observer. So we can observe ourselves. Right now I can observe myself having this conversation with you. But how can we do that? How can we observe ourselves? It's almost as if we kind of come out of ourselves, and I can kind of see the back of my head as I'm talking to you. We all have the ability to do this. And so I think that so I'll come back to that bit. So upon death, I think that this essence water is able to go from a liquid into some kind of vibrational vapor without the need for boiling. And because I think we know so little about water, there are many stages we just haven't identified yet, but there is also a lot more information to learn within the subtleties of each stage and phase. So I think that this essence water, the observer essentially of ourselves, is able to go from this liquid into a vibrational vapor, a type of gas. So when a gas expands, it cools, which is why people would feel spirit as cold. But then it immediately becomes the observer. So when I've interviewed several people that have had near-death experiences, they all say that they feel themselves rising, which is what happens as a gas, and they become observant of themselves. 3 of them said, "Oh, I hope that person's going to be okay," when they look down at their body. An interesting thing, as a side note, I interviewed a man by the name of Hone Edmonds, whose heart had stopped beating for 25 minutes before his heart was brought back, although he was in a coma for a long time after that. He wrote a book about his experience, and I was interested to know if what he saw in the afterlife that was relative to water. And he told me that he went through this, after he kind of had observed himself and asked himself, "I hope that person's going to be okay." He said he went through this kind of like a hallway, and once he went through and he was in a subtle body, so he knew it was in a type of body, but it was kind of a light body. And interestingly, he said he was actually lying down as if he was like floating along, lying down, his feet first, and then he got to the end of that tunnel way, that kind of, which had pictures, and each picture was one of his lives. And so then he got to the end where he was met with his grandfather and his son who had passed. And anyway, long story short, he said he was in this beautiful place, and there was streams, and there was mountains with snow on, and all these things. And he said it was the most perfectly beautiful place. He said the only interesting thing for him was that all the birds that he saw were white. They had no color. And so anyway, quickly moving along, his grandfather tells him that he has to go back, and he doesn't want to go back, so he gets to his knees and he starts to cry, and he watches his tears fall on his grandfather's feet. For me, there is this saying we have that eyes are the windows to the soul, and I think then tears are an expression of spirit. And I think that tears are actually emotion we can both see and taste and touch. And one of the most wonderful things I learned recently is that we're such sophisticated beings that the water within us can make medicine for us. So in our deepest sorrow, when we are really, really sad and we cry, our tears and face, they're designed that the tears will come out of our eyes, go around our cheeks and straight back into our mouth, because they're actually made to be taken back inside as a medicine, because they have all the structural integrity to help ease our heart.
Wow. But before you go on, Vida, I'm blown away, by the way. I just had a couple of questions pertaining to the sort of informed versus uninformed water as well as when someone physically, their body or shell, if you will, passes away, and like you said, they sort of evaporate into this gaseous substance that we still can't really decipher. In your opinion, do you think this gaseous substance of whatever nature it is could be what we often refer to as plasma? And I ask this because if you recall in last week's lecture that you were so kind to join us with Dan Winter, I asked why this constant pressure in the academic community, not just in the West, but around the world, to, discuss plasma in general. Do you think that could be sort of a train of a pathway that may lead to what you're seeing in your work?
Yeah, I do. I do.
Mm,
And I think, again, there's subtleties and layers within water that we have still to identify with. And ether is a really big part of that. And so, ether and this plasma, I mean, there can be variance within that. I mean, to me, it just kind of makes sense. So, to go into this further, and I'll just, I'll keep going on with this presentation. But for me, the fact that we can observe ourselves. So here's what I think. I think that we have this fluid water, this fluid body, this moving body, this like ocean inside of this skin body. But I think we feel energy because we have an electrical charge. That electrical charge can be measured through heart math. It can be measured, and we understand that. Because not only does our heart and our brain and various organs give us an electrical energy, we're also salt water, and salt is essentially electrical. So we're giving off an electrical energy. So the water in the air is attracted to this electrical charge. We walk around, if we could see ourselves in a slightly different way, we would see that we have this liquid water, but then we have what's like a web that's holding all of this microscopic dew. And that is a way in which we feel into a room. How does this room feel to us? How does this person feel to us? And this energetic web is the water transferring energy, the water in the air transferring information into this fluid body that we have. And so we're able to feel things that we can't necessarily explain. And so when we have, when we're the observer of ourselves in a dream, for example, so I've done work where I've left a petri dish of water beside my bed and invited it to share information with me. I've invited it to basically journey with me on my dream and show me a picture of something relative to the dream. And I've done a whole study on that, and it's phenomenal because I see it working as if I actually am intentionally telling the water what I'm thinking. But I don't know what I'm going to dream. The pictures are so clear. It suggests that water is accompanying me into this dream state, into the subconscious and unconscious states. And so when we observe ourselves in a dream, or we potentially have the ability to astral travel and all kinds of things, then how do we come back into our body? Like how is it that this essence water is able to get and it can move in and out of the body? And I think it can move in and out of the body because there's still an electrical charge. So even when somebody has died, there's proof that the brain still has some electrical charge. There's still some movement in there, whether it's for all kinds of reasons that I don't know all the reasons. But that suggests there's still some electrical energy going on. And so I think once that stops, that's when that essence water is able to leave completely and transition. And so I think it can, so I don't know if it's a liquid or if it's a gas in the body.
right.
But I believe that it's able to move from the inside to the outside.
Right. And if I may ask one more thing as it pertains to informed versus uninformed water,
Yeah.
I could not help but think of whether it's the hermetic principles, as above, so below, the yin and the yang of things. I could not help but think of that duopoly of life, if you will, similar to that of, a toroid field or a magnet, positive and negative charge, that sort of imperfect but perfect balance. Does that resonate with you as well?
hmm Well, it's definitely possible. And again, I would say that I feel like an absolute infant amongst giants at this point with this work. Even though I've been doing it for 9 years, still so in awe. And I'm learning new and more amazing things as every single day. And now more people are doing this work and seeing this language of water that I'm going to share in a minute. You can see then that it is a global, potentially even universal communication. So this was an interesting one. I have a friend who is a big water guy, and he asked me if I would put 2 petri dishes of water out so that all his friends around the world could send love to the water on his birthday. So I did that, no problem. And I left because he was in England, and so he wanted to get everybody around the world, so he wanted me to leave it out overnight. But what he didn't know is that there was a 3rd petri dish that I put out. Each petri dish had the same amount of water in it. The 3rd dish, I simply said, can you connect to my friend's dad who had passed? And what was very curious is that overnight something had happened that I couldn't explain. I came back out in the morning, and the 2 dishes that he knew about had all the same water in them. But the one that I'd asked for his father to connect to, the water had evaporated so much that there was very little water left in it. So I thought, well, I'll just freeze what's left. And what I froze is this pitcher. All the water turned into a heart. But how that happened, I'm still not sure. Whether spirit used the water as an energy source, or there was a transfer, or something happened, but something happened. It was a very interesting thing to observe. I asked, do you see me? Interesting that you see three eyes. So this is a little bit about the dream stuff. So I keep adding to them because I keep doing more work, but I have this available on my website, so if people are interested in dreams to kind of go through my whole study. But basically I dreamt that I was in a sailboat, then I was going through all kinds of turbulent waves, and so you can see that it's captured the sailboat. So you get an idea of like what we're seeing. This was really interesting. I dreamt that I went to the center of the earth and entered a cave that had a sacred pool. Somehow I knew it was the real fountain of youth, but I hadn't gone there for that reason, and I had no intention of jumping in. Anyway, I sat on a rock and I looked up out of the cave entrance, and I saw the moon, and then I turned around and looked down into the water. And what was interesting, even in my dream it was interesting, was that there appeared to be a fountain reflected, but no fountain above. And if you look at the second photo, which is the same photo flipped, you can see the fountain that I saw in my dream. So, I mean, one of the reasons I do the dream work is because people always say, oh, it must be your consciousness affecting the water. Even in saying that, it's suggesting that water is able to do that, which makes me smile. But when you're dreaming, you're not conscious in the way we are when we're awake. So this is a very interesting and curious way where I'm actually observing water, observing me.
I wonder if it's a particular brain wave that the water is connecting to. Because yeah, as you're saying that it's in your conscious state, it's in like the collective unconscious of people that don't even know that you're doing it, and then when you're dreaming as well. Because Mr. Winter, he's done a lot of work with the theta brain waves, and that's I think that's the brain wave that they've been able to tap into that shows that when you're connecting to your ancestor memory, that's the brain wave that is being activated. So I just wonder if there's connections there. And I also wanted to bring up with the near-death experience, that's really fascinating because, again, Mr. Winter is talking about how in these ancient initiation groups, they would have a fake near-death experience as a way to basically you see your whole life and connect to source. So that's interesting that you were doing that. And then there was another thing. Oh, and he did a recent documentary with Elena Denon explaining stargates and the science and physics of stargates. So I wonder if that's going to be tying into Yorick, because he actually explains that it's the liquefaction process is what he calls when you actually go through the stargate. And it's called the liquefaction process. So it's like, just that ties in so perfectly with the stargate being intelligence. And you can't interact with the stargate if you are angry. You have to have the proper non-destructive charge imploding like energy, like inhabiting the array. So it's just all very fascinating. This all ties in together.
That's one of the things I love about this work, because I've always had a lot of very deep questions, and I've followed lot of different belief systems, like what, not followed, but been curious and studied what a lot of people believe. Some of the deepest, biggest questions I've ever had have been answered through these realms of water. So this was like a whole kind of thing where I'm trying to like move this. I'm not sure how to make this if it's smaller. I can't seem to. Anyway, I was taken into a dark lit room, and you can just basically read it. But essentially, a lady was speaking in a different language. I was in a room. I had this mind fold. Did I have it here? This, like, you know, those kind of things you put over your eyes that like completely blindfold you. It's a special thing called a mind fold. So I had that on, and so I started seeing things. And it was like I was dreaming while being awake, and they were monitoring and recording my brain waves. And I was watching kind of what looked like a moon, and I was watching a planet in front of it, and this planet was more like a disc and had a woman's face. And she had an aura around her and was meditating and communicating with the stars in front of her. And she was also communicating with me in her own way. And she created the little moon behind her just from thinking about it. And she was creating many more things. And she telepathically told me that I was part of her creation. And so how water has picked that up, I think, is so incredibly beautiful and detailed. And then I dreamt that I was in the space kind of ship. And so as you kind of read through this, essentially, it's a very interesting kind of story. And they were kind of working with a species of human that had been bred with a type of alien species. And so they were very much observing things, and it was all kept top secret, so it was outside of Earth, but not that far away. You know, one of them died after being given an injection and was thrown out of the spaceship in this kind of spacesuit that water is captured.
Vida, are you sure this was a dream, or this was a remote viewing experience you had?
You know, when I posted this on social media, that's a lot of people ask me that. I don't know. I mean, so many incredible things have happened in my life that it's very difficult for me to know sometimes. But either way, I woke up and assumed that it was a dream, and potentially it was more than that. So remote tests. So this is kind of cool. So this is one where basically, I rang a friend of mine up from New Zealand when I was in New Zealand, and she lives in the States. And I said, hey, can you just project a thought into my petri dish over here in New Zealand? And then her husband came over on the Zoom call and waved, and they'd just recently got married. And I'm like, oh, maybe he'd do it. That would make it even more random, because I didn't know him. And so he was a good sport. And so she just said, oh, just think of something, and sent it to her petri dish of water. And he was this big burly guy, and I think he thought I was crazy. But anyway, that's fine. But he did it. And so I know 100% that this is not my thought or me, because I've been vegetarian since I was 8. And he was thinking of going shooting, because he was shooting for pheasant. And so you can see his hand is around like this bird that looks very much like a pheasant, and you can see that kind of bill thing up the top, and the hand is holding the bird. And so it was a very interesting photo. And then this one, I have a friend in India who's been scared of drowning her entire life. And so she had been going to therapy, And so when I rang her, I said, just project any thought you have into the water. And so what she was thinking about was what her therapist had told her to do. Like she couldn't even go in a bath. She stood in India, and I've spent a lot of time there. You can have showers termed as like this bucket shower, where you stand in a bucket and you tip the water over yourself. That's as kind of much as she could ever do. She was so afraid. And so it was debilitating. So her therapist had said, start with just imagining that you are standing in water with your head above water. And so she would imagine that she was in the river Ganges because she thought, well, she's going to die. She'd like to die there. And then she would always have her head above water. So this is an image of her. And she also said that she was standing on a rock. She'd imagine herself standing on a rock with her head above water. And this is the image that I got. And then when I showed her, she was so surprised because none of them told me what they were thinking until after I showed them the photo. So this is just curious. I've observed some odd things happen where water seems to thicken when exposed to more negative aspects. So the top picture is what the water looks like after you express gratitude to it. And so it's also a hydroglyph, which means living and gratitude. Now below it is the same water after the emotion of frustration and anger was projected into it. And I've told you that water freezes in layers. So what's curious is that the layers seem to be condensed and very thick and much harder. So you can't see through it really very easily at all. And I can't explain how this really happens. It's a very unusual phenomena.
Can I just say, Vita, the top photograph on the top left seems to be, at least I interpret that as what humanity could be like if there was a sort of unison in a conscious way, maybe not with everyone, but a fair percentage. And then the bottom left picture seems to represent, if you will, chaos. And I can't help but think of this concept of esotericism. You know, the more negative one is, the more denser realms they go to, if that allegedly, not saying that that is fact, but yeah, wow.
That resonates. And the other one is after the same water, after being exposed to a 5G tower, I put it right beside it for 15 minutes. It completely ruined its structure. And then the spring water on the right was so I had a healing experience, which I won't go into too much because it's kind of lengthy. But essentially the water came out of a deep underwater aquifer in New Zealand. It was one of those medicine waters that I've talked about that I spotted around the world. Its pH straight out of the ground was 9.9. So I was able to use that, and then I compared it to ionized water, which has gone through, it's basically electrocuted and gone through a process, and it is kind of brought to this kind of thickening again. So it's very interesting to observe. So, you know, we have a lot of information in our body, which is often overlooked. So there is a test that's been around for many, many, many years, where basically a woman will spit onto a piece of like glass, and there's a magnifying glass, and you look through it, and if she is fertile, you'll see these kinds of ferns appear in the saliva. If she is not, you won't see that. So this is intelligent water of our own body showing us some information about ourselves and this of when we're ovulating. It's very interesting. I told you about the tears. This is one of my most recent posts actually on social media. I was very concerned because I've come out to the States numerous times now, and I've studied the albumin and tested the albumin of, which is essentially the egg white, the thin part of the egg white, on many different eggs bought from stores. But they always showed that kind of first top left pattern. So really healthy eggs should form 6 patterns that I've identified, which is another study that I've done. And usually in New Zealand, I would be able to see these complex patterns just from free-range eggs, even from a store. But here, I was beginning to wonder, is it just that there's too many like environmental problems, like what's going on? But I went to a farm where I spoke at in Fillmore, and the event was called Sowing Sovereignty, and I bought some of the free-range eggs in one of the most amazing containers I've ever seen. And so the middle one is the crystallography of those healthy free-range eggs, but it's what they're free-ranging on that is also important, like the health of the soil, the health of the water. It goes into the egg information. And what I observed, though, is that when I put the battery farmed chicken eggs beside the healthy free-range eggs, it improved their structure. And I've never seen that happen. Not that I've never thought to try it before, but in all of the crystallography from the eggs that I've tested so far that came from barn-laid and battery-farmed hens, they always formed that first top left pattern. I've never seen them improve. So to see them improve through being in proximity to a healthy chicken egg was very, very interesting to me, because I've seen the same thing happen with two different types of water. The water that healed me, freshly collected from a spring, sitting next to tap water, which fails to form very good structures. When you test the crystallography the next day, the information has been shared, or at least some of it has been shared with the tap water, so it crystallographically improves. But even its pH will go up slightly. So its pH could have been a 7.3, and then it can go all the way up to like a 7.6. And so it's very interesting how information can be shared. Now, obviously the common question will be, but can it go the other way around? You know, if there are lots of bad eggs, will it change the good egg? Or if there's lots and lots of bad water, will it change the good water? So in nature, and if this is a natural process, nature is always looking to improve on itself. Water isn't like nature is always, it's like the fittest, the strongest, and often, in the animal kingdom, they'll kill any kind of runts or young that have issues, or they'll be left behind and they won't survive. So in this amniotic fluid, this kind of early embryonic stage, of course, water, the water within that, or the energy of that, the nature is trying to improve itself. So it will actually pull from the strongest. It wants to get better. It doesn't want to get destroyed. It's only when you get into the realm of sometimes human thinking that tends to happen. But in the animal kingdom, that's not how it goes. And in this early stage, before all of those thought processes can start forming, where someone may want to do something bad, I think that the idea, the thought, oh, but does the bad influence the good, is a very, very adult thought because we've become very cynical. But in the early stages, within this realm and in the fluid water realm, I think that the nature is always looking to upgrade, not degrade. So I'm doing a test this week coming up where I'm going to put one of these beautiful free-range eggs and surround it by a lot of battery farmed eggs and see if it impacts it, or see if by proximity the ones around it start to improve, and then it gets lesser and lesser as they go out, or how it works. So this is where I got a monarch butterfly caterpillar, and I had a petri dish of no water, and I simply carefully put the little caterpillar, it walked along, and then I took it off, I put it back onto the swan plant. Then I came back inside. I couldn't see a residue, but I put some water in it, and then I froze it, and you can see that it's captured the essence of the caterpillar. So there is an essence an energy that was picked up by the water. Same thing here with worms, but the spots are just because I couldn't get all the dirt off the worms, and I didn't want to traumatize the worms, so I just put them in the dish, and they wiggled around in there, and then I put them back in the ground, and then I put some water in it, froze it, and both of the worms showed because I put 2 worms in the dish. This is where I've said shalom to the water, and many people think this looks somewhat like an archangel or something like that. I said, do you know who I am? And I didn't show the picture on the right to the water. That wasn't an influence. That's so that you can see how I link my initials. So I've done this a couple of times and got the same result. It's always fractionally different, but you can see when something's slightly the same. I said the word Maui, and in New Zealand there is a great Maori warrior called Maui, and he was said to fish up the North Island with his grandmother's jawbone, and so this fishhook is very representative of him. And so it's interesting, just the word, the name, has shared an image relative to its historical mythological story.
Vida, I must ask, do you conduct these observations, or I know you don't like to call it experiments, but do you conduct these where in a geographical vicinity with the least amount of frequency interference, least amount of cell? I just wonder if there may be, like, for example, if I were to go into a metropolitan city, if I would get the same results you're getting by chance or not, maybe.
It's a really good question. And I really want to talk about why relationship makes a difference in that area. I have done work in a big part of last year's work was done where I was staying at my kind of adopted mum's place, out in the most incredibly pristine, beautiful area right on a beach. It was absolutely gorgeous. It was like forest and farm, and it was like amazing. There was virtually it was very difficult to get any signal whatsoever. And I did a lot of work there. I also have done a lot of work from various different places where I've lived, because I've moved around a bit. And some areas there is great Wi-Fi, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. And I've also done work within city realms. And so it's interesting because I've used, you do see how the EMF affects the water, especially when it's coming out, if you're using water that already doesn't have a high kind of structure to it. And by structure, I mean, that's such a blanket term. But what I'm talking about is when I freeze water, I'm looking at its structural integrity. And water has what I term as an energetic state of health. So, for example, spring water tends to form beautiful hexagonal patterns. Sometimes this kind of fern hexagon that I call it, that we saw in some of the examples before, it can take up the whole petri dish. That's a wonderful example of water's being in its pure energetic healthy state. But when you take tap water, and it's not its fault, it's gone through a lot of right angles and filled with various different pollutants and chemicals and heavy metals, your compassion can restructure that water. So you can take tap water and simply hold it to your heart. And then when you, and I always recommend people get to know your water. And if tap water is your control, have done of at least 10 different crystallographic photos first to see, without any influence, as much as you can, just see, okay, let me invite water to share me its structures. Get to know your water first. So when you see how your patterns of tap water form, then if you fill that tap water up and put the water next to your heart long enough, as if you would a child, so it can hear your heart beating, you'll notice that these little ferns start to form in the crystallography. It starts to energetically heal. You can also put the same tap water into a singing bowl and play it, and then take photos of that water afterwards and see a structural change. it's encouraging, because what you see in someone who's sick, say someone has been diagnosed by a doctor that they have a disease, but they still have the choice of to be happy or sad. So someone might come and give them a hug if they're feeling sad, and I liken tap water to kind of being a little bit unwell. And so when you care for that person and you tell them something nice and you give them a hug, they feel better. So there is an energetic shift, an energetic change. And although doctors may say they still have this disease, that energetic positive change is still going to actually help them heal faster. And so this energetic structural change that I see in tap water, based on conscious expression, based on various different restructuring things like vortexing or filtering through silk, that's a really big one. I'm in the process of putting a silk filter together with my partner, because I have seen such massive differences when you use beautiful silk as a filter. And Rudolf Steiner gave me that idea that water filtered through silk holds a lot of properties. Even in a conversation I had with Jerry Pollack, where they were doing a test, water that's simply sitting beside silk seems to start to have the ability to start building EZ, exclusion zone water, fourth phase water. And
May I
so,
ask, Vita, sorry, why do you think silk in particular, of all different materials?
well, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects to it, and I have mixed feelings about silk myself. But just in regards to the silkworm seems to have to die to make the silk, but the silk itself is made prior to that. So there is this, you think about it's creating a space for transformation. So when you think about that and you add that into water transforming, it kind of makes sense. It brings it back to that cocoon, that kind of place that is sacred, that has got a space for transformation and transmutation. And that's why I think of the
Gotcha.
energy of silk. But, you know, I've spent a lot of time in India, and I go out to the villages, and I observed something really interesting one day, where there was a group of women, just a small group of women, and they were at the pump, where the water comes out of, and one of them was holding their sari and the other one was helping them hold it out, and they were using the silk sari as a water filter. And the lady translating was saying, yeah, we do that because we know that it's making the water more spiritual, more healthy, more clean for us, and it's a sacred act.
I
And
would,
so,
sorry, I would like to thank Riel for just bringing this up to me. And I was thinking of something similar. UFOs have been known in rare cases to disseminate a sort of silk type. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of such cases, a silk type material over top trees, over top grass. Usually it's over top very natural places on the earth. And sometimes this silk will remain for just minutes. Other times it will remain for days, but it does disappear on its own. But people who witness these crafts doing this seem to almost as if the craft is trying to heal a particular part of nature, if that makes sense. Using, I apologize deeply for interrupting you, but I couldn't help but think of this similar silk with, you know, as they say, the paranormal or esoteric or etheric realms.
I mean, that totally resonates for me. Um, I mean, even spiders create these kind of webs, like this kind of like, there's a kind of a interesting kind of thread thing. Sometimes it's different. Like there's different spiders in New Zealand. Sometimes you can see it's kind of like this very thick layer, and you can see it over all of them. And it tends to be where they all have their babies. But there is this interesting aspect to that that's always seemed like something is happening in there that we just don't really understand. And there is this mystery around it. And even the silk from lotus, the lotus flower, the lotus stem, I think, where they're able to take, it's a very lengthy, time-consuming process. They have to use so much of the lotus to make it. but there is something incredibly sacred and beautiful about it. And you know, I actually think, when you think in this term of this kind of thread, this web, this cocoon, it ties in which what I said around how I think the water, the evaporated water in the air is working like a web attracted to that electrical charge. And so there could be some tie-in around a more visible aspect of that. So this is a little bit about the hydroglyphs. I'm wondering whether actually maybe I should just show you the actual, or the different glyphs, because there's a lot of them, but I don't want to take up too much of your time, and I'm happy to share more if you
Whatever
want
you feel
to.
is whatever you feel is best. I myself don't necessarily have a time limit. Whatever you feel.
Okay, so as I've sort of mentioned before, so to get one hydroglyph, I have to have seen it appear in the ice at least 50 times, showing the same symbol. For all my hydroglyphs, I use words, because I understand that water reads the energy of a word. So each hydroglyph has a layer of meaning. I haven't identified them all yet. It is literally kind of like trying to learn a language not based on any other language. And so it is very interesting. So what I've just put together here for you is just examples of 64 examples of a few of them. So here we have the hydroglyph. Now I can't actually zoom in on it, so what I will do is go back to the hydroglyph PDF and actually show you so you can. Essentially, this is that fern hexagon that we saw earlier. It's very interesting. Death is not a mistake. A man reached out to me a while back and he says, I've been given only a few months to live. Please can you ask me how water perceives death? So I wrote the word death and I kept seeing the living glyph and I'm like, that can't be right. And I kept doing it and doing it and doing it, and after I'd done it more than 50 times, I'm like, okay, I get it now. Water doesn't die. It's always just in one of its states. It doesn't see death the way that we do. Death is simply a transformation, a transmutation of life. And so that was very, very interesting to me. So the message glyph is one that the group of us, we've all seen all of these. But the message glyph is very interesting because it's like this, I call it the frilled angle. It kind of looks like an angle with frills on it, but on the surface there's some very interesting things to look at, and I'll go in and show you what they are. Now I like to identify these with things I see in nature as well, which is why I put the shark tooth and the snowflake. Now change, it also now, when I say potential meaning, it's because I've used that word and seen it show up, but I haven't done it 50 times yet, but I have now with winter, and it does mean winter. It's very interesting that money also means abundance, and abundance doesn't necessarily mean money. And so I have so our relationship with coins is really interesting. If you go back in history and look in a lot of wells, you will see that we have been flicking coins into a well for centuries and centuries in the hope that our wish will come true. So in more older times, there was the belief that there was a deity or a nymph or an energy within the water that was able to use the water to be able to grant you a wish, and there had to be some exchange. And even in ancient Roman times, when someone would die, they would place coins on that person's eyes to basically as payment for the person who took you across the river to take you to Hades. So the idea of coins and water and money, it's interesting. But I've also observed that money doesn't actually have to apply to physical fiat money. It can also apply to cryptocurrencies and various things like that. It's not just stuck to what we understand. So water understands what we understand money to be. if you
I,
understand.
right. I couldn't help but think of for those watching and listening, some are more on the, material nuts and bolts side of things. Others are more into the esoteric. I could not help but think of the concept of when you said how it does not just apply to fiat currency, also to cryptocurrency. That notion of soul contracts, I think it's been called. Not that it has to be called that, but that's, I think, what it's been referred to. Sort of an understanding and agreement energetically where there's an obligation to reciprocate some type of action between two parties that, again, we doesn't have to be written on paper whatsoever.
Absolutely. But I also like that it means abundance, and
Right.
I've seen that happen 50 times because you can be abundant in a lot of other things other than money. So it's a mixed bag, but it's interesting thing about the coin is that it's very metallic looking. It sort of sticks out of the ice, and you can see more than one in there. This is something I found interesting. One of my favorite hydroglyphs is the top left, which is the hydroglyph for creation. Now, what you'll notice is that creation glyph has got those little seeds down the bottom. So that's how you know it's the creation glyph. That also means fire. Now, another version of the creation glyph, as you go along to the top right, doesn't have seeds, it's just got the waves, and that means water. And the bottom left is more of a feathering, which is air, and then there's a speckling, which is earth. So within the creation glyph, it's also given us all of the elements. So all of these you could see in one sample of the creation glyph. So sometimes it doesn't create the seed, but it creates the waves. Sometimes when they melt, they can create these other two at the bottom. It's very, very interesting what I've started to observe within this creation glyph.
This personally reminds me of, how philosophers have postulated in the past, I think, therefore I am. I couldn't help but think when looking at that, I am, therefore I think. By knowing oneself, the concept of that seeding and growing starts to become much more of a reality and then manifests into, as we call it, I guess, the physical.
Yeah. Oh, I absolutely think you're right. There's so much to wonder about. If you want, I'm happy to share the hydroglyphs and just kind of like a bit how to read them if you
Please,
want.
absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, I'll just get that up. Just pull this along. So essentially what I'm saying here is just around how I do it, and how I do this, and by writing the word and repeating it. So the tree of life means wholeness. Now what's really interesting is that you'll see these two ovals on either side, and that's also a hydroglyph, which means lungs, and it also means breathing. So essentially it's breathing into wholeness, and when you think of trees as the lungs of the planet, it kind of makes sense. And it's kind of like this toroidal field around here as well. So you kind of look at that aspect, those circles around it. It's very interesting. The lungs, here we go.
Wow.
So you can see they are very similar to lungs, but you also see it in that tree of life glyph. Its potential meanings also are oxygen in the respiratory system. The lotus means enlightenment. Here are 62 examples of that. So it means kind. It might mean kind and lotus and enlightened. It also does mean purity. So you
Wow.
can like see how gorgeous they are.
Incredible.
This water drop means to cleanse. It potentially also means rain, and a few other things. The emanation means free energy. So I wrote the word free energy as well as energy, and it looks kind of like something you'd see coming out of Tesla's workshop. So I like to associate it with something in nature. So that's why a picture from something in nature is there. I think these are really quite exquisite. And it looks like a spider web here.
You know, as they say, we get our best tricks from nature.
That's it. The magic wand means magic. And it potentially also means abracadabra, which in Hebrew is I will create as I speak.
Huh. Wow.
Now the heart creates love, like love creates hearts, and you can have all different kinds of love and all different shapes and forms of hearts. The ring means sacred union and marriage. This is one of my most beautiful pictures of a ring, by the way. I love how it's even designed like a kind of diamond thing up there. But what they often will look like are these metallic bands.
Wow.
So this is this is the living hexagon, and you've seen this. And so this is what I'm talking about the message glyph. So this is the message glyph, but it's almost as if this is also a message. So understanding what this on top of it means is going to take a long time. Like there is just so much to do and so much to learn that it can actually be a little overwhelming. And I have people around the world getting these message glyphs and other glyphs, and we're all trying to work with people that are very knowledgeable in different languages and symbols and this kind of thing, trying to get some grasp of meaning.
Dare I say that looks like a form of communication of some type to me. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there is one which looks where it looks similar to those lines, which actually means information. So this is going to seem random, but it's not random when you know the story. I wanted to see if water could show me different time frames. So I write Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, got nothing, nothing, nothing. I did Easter, I did Christmas, I did Waitangi Day, which is a public holiday in New Zealand, and nothing, nothing, nothing. And so I'm being filmed for a mini-series at the moment, and the lady that's doing that, she's the director of a show called Magical Egypt. So she's fairly familiar with hieroglyphs. And she said, well, when something is building up to something, like a marriage, there's a lot of planning, there's a lot of things going into it, there's a lot of energy. And then the actual day happens, the build-up has more energy sometimes than the actual day, because it's been days and days and days of planning. And afterwards, then there is the marriage, there is the next stage.
Right.
So she said the energy is very strong on either side of an event. Why don't you do before and after an event? So I did before and after Christmas, nothing. Before and after. The only thing I got was before and after Easter. So the thing that struck me when I first did this was that it looked like a cross. But what you can see here is that there is this line across here. And that was curious to me. Kind of like a reversed 4. So as I mentioned, I try to find things in nature, but I couldn't find anything. But someone in my private Facebook group, which is called The Secret Intelligence of Water, C for cat, M for mother, P for Peter, CMP lab, because my technique is called CMP. It stands for Collective Molecular Photography. I think the waters are working as a kind of, the molecules are working as a kind of collective, like pixels do for a photo. And so that group is specifically only for people that have my technique and are actively sharing it.
Wow.
And sharing their work. And so he said, oh, I found this thing that reminds me of the reversed 4. It's a Gildry symbol for people that within this kind of group called the Gildry. It was their sign to say that they built the church or the stained glass window or something. They'd make that sign. But then post-Easter is just the cross with no line. So I didn't even know these existed, but I showed it to, when I found it, I was so surprised, and I said to a guy I work in India, who is in India, and he said, come to India, they're everywhere. I'm like, I've never seen them before. It also looks like it means spring, but it's a very interesting thing when you start to see how it reoccurs, these crosses. And so it suggests that there is some importance for us, because it wouldn't give me any other time frame. It's only giving me before and after Easter. And so I think that it's relevant for us, because we're coming up to Easter now. And so, like, what is the significance of knowing what is happening before us that month and after that month?
Right. Could one speculate it may have to do with astrology with respects to, say, some grand clock, if you will, that, the life in the universe is a constant cycle of sorts, hence even the, speaking to the concept of water never really dying per se. I wonder if again, the reason why, again, this is just speculation, there are those lines with the cross before Easter, and then they disappear after Easter due to some planetary alignment in frequency, and that sort of resonates here on the planet, as you say, speaks to our collective conscious. I'm just throwing ideas out, but
Well, if you think about it, that month is based on the full moon. So you may well be right.
wow, okay, I didn't even think of that. Thank you.
These empty stars mean imagination. And when you see more than one, it often means you have two things you're imagining, or two people are imagining the same thing. And
Wow.
this is really cute. Like, it means friends. So there's one big one and one small one, and they touch. It potentially also means together, bond, and trust. This is a close-up of what that coin looks like. So, and you saw the winter tree, means change. Do you remember this from earlier in our?
Yes.
It means completion. When you saw it in the pyramid.
Yes, it completed a healing, I would imagine. I mean,
Well, I guess there's a lot. It means, like, it could mean finished and full. I'm still in the process of adding the extras to this one, but it's very interesting that completion would be stamped in that pyramid that we saw in the beginning of this. So I wanted to leave that for you to see that.
I appreciate that. I wonder if that signifies that the building of the pyramid was complete, or those that go into the pyramid to be healed are, you know what I mean? Wow, that's incredible.
There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn, and there's so much information. That's the other thing. These joined circles mean conception, but they could potentially mean pregnant, evolve, and expand. And then you can get, like, heaps of circles like this, which means to multiply or multiplication, and they remind me of these the octopus suckers. And
Right.
sometimes there's so many, you can see how many are over here. And
Whoa.
what's interesting is that a lot of these, like, I have people sending me their work and their hydroglyphs, and within a week coming up to a full moon, I had a lot of people see the same glyph, this multiplication glyph, which was really interesting. So I've observed now, because I'm working with a lot of people, sometimes we see very similar glyphs coming up to a full moon.
So, wow. And these are people all scattered
All
across the
around the
globe.
world. All
Whoa.
around the world. Yeah, different water, different languages, different cultures, everything.
Does that, if I may ask, do you ever wonder or speculate in your own mind if A, water is trying to communicate with us, or if something, or B, if something is trying to use water to communicate with us, or maybe C, all of the above, a bit of both?
I think that's going to get into a big conversation, because I think we have to ask the question, what is water?
Mm,
So we only identify ourselves and other things from what we can see and perceive. The thing is that we are used to believing that anything alive has to be in a body. Because
right.
when we see death, we see that the body is then can't move, and it goes into rigor mortis. It's not active anymore. Something left, something changed, something died.
Mm,
So we have an attachment to this idea of living and body. And that's any kind of body, you know. And so when you start to ask the question, what is life outside of the body? I say to children, if your skin was invisible and your organs were see-through, what would you look like? We would
Wow.
treat each other so differently
Yep.
if we didn't see the skin. Even though we see with our fourth phase water eyes that are bimolecular count 99% water.
Right. So you're, if I may add, just to make sure I'm following where you're going here with this, is that I, I think this speaks to the concept of what's been referred to as anthropocentric bias, where we immediately think, okay, everything that has to be living must be in a shell of some kind, but who is to say, right? Mm,
Yeah, I mean, even a subtle body could sort of potentially be a subtle shell. The thing is that there are a lot of concepts, and I think that sometimes we're missing things in plain sight. You
right.
see, when I think about water, I think there is a friend of mine called Moses Hackman who says that water is the glove on the hand of consciousness. I think consciousness and water work perfectly and in unison together. When you think about anything that has been conceived is held within some kind of water, whether it's amniotic fluid or a type of jelly like frogs,
Right.
or any of these kinds of things. That information in the water is sharing ancestral wisdom, anyway, I believe so, to the embryo. The information is this sacred kind of pool. And so if you were to imagine everything without its shell that is alive, you will always come back to water, salt, and consciousness on some level.
Wow.
And so I think the perception we have of what is alive is in fact formed from what we've been taught.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. It's like when we had thought at one point that actually up until recently, which I still find to be quite I guess you could say laughable, that there had to be the only type of life that could be supported at all is the type of life that supports us. But then it was found that there's life underneath in the Antarctic, right? As they say, although I would not to, be a tinfoil hatter, as they say, but I would dare to say, Vita, your work is exactly what those for so long of human elites, as we call them, have tried to suppress and control, because inquiring about these things, I would dare to say, comes full circle with everything in life, which sort of reveals the unfortunate lies we've been told and things like this, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's one of the reasons that I'm so actively sharing my work, because something happens to you
Right.
when you do this yourself. Something changes inside of you. People, it's like how to, you can say form a relationship with nature, but we all can find that in our own ways. We naturally do that because all our children, our family, our loved ones are bodies of water. We know how to have relationship with water. We are having relationship with water every day. And so it's interesting because we don't think we're so fluid, but we're just a cut away from leaking. We're an
Right.
emotion away from leaking. We leak all the time.
Right.
And so when we think about that, there is so much information held in this watery space. And Bruce Lee said, be like water, my friend. Water becomes the cup. It becomes the teapot. What if water has become the human? You don't really fully grasp sometimes, not you specifically, but that what he was saying be like water. What is water like? Water is transparent, it's non-judgmental, it will enter the body of an ant as easily as it will enter the body of a king or a queen. Water is always going back to source. And so are we. How we get there is up to us.
Wow. I couldn't agree more. I also wonder if water is that, as you say, final quote unquote physical layer before there's that, you know, a piezoelectric blueprint or something of the
Hmm.
sort, as optogeneticists are now saying. They're calling uh, EMF fields, and the way that these electrons can store memories, they're calling it the software of things, sort of like. And it's funny because the more progressive thinking scientists tend to be attacked by the more traditional ones that say, no, no, it cannot be because there's these set of rules and that's it. So
Yeah.
it's, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's been when anyone's paradigm is challenged, uh, it can be confronting for
Yeah.
people, and we all react and respond differently because I think one of the gifts we have is the ability to change our mind. One of the gifts we have is the ability to be open-minded. But that's also a choice. We kind of have these ways we tend to want to feel comfortable in our life.
Right.
Some people feel very comfortable in one direction where everything is very black and white, and some people prefer a lot of grey, and there's always a lot of grey. There's always grey.
Right.
It's always going to be grey where there's black and white.
It's true.
Anyway, these really do go on for quite some time. Then it just goes into like trying to understand them. Um, and, you know, you can, honestly, there are so many.
Wow.
Um, but
Actually, I did. Oh, sorry.
yes.
I did want to ask if, for those that are watching or listening to this later on, do you have any recommendations for how one would be willing to try this at home with respects to try and find a place of, say, bliss and peace, something more, you know, relaxing environment, try and stay away from certain objects? Do you have any advice for those? Because I feel as though I'm going to get bombarded after people see this from my audience saying, Dave, ask Vita how I could do this at home. So I figure I might as well ask now, if that's all right.
Well, of course. I mean, I do everything at home in my kitchen. And so I am, I'm a water researcher, but I also have 3 children, and I do a lot of stuff. And so relationship is the most important thing. I do these workshops, and I'm basically teaching people how to do this. In fact, I could show you one that I recorded. It's a little snippet where yesterday I did a workshop, and this lady, it was the first time she ever did this work. So I help you get your freezer setting right, teach you what to look for, give you a demonstration, and recommend that you simply invite water to show you whatever it wants rather than going into this controlling relationship. And I
Mm,
want to talk about relationship. But I think it's on my desktop. Basically, what it's showing you is her getting this image of a horse. And I didn't know this, but apparently she works with wild horses. And she got this image, and it was her first ever try. And so I'm putting this kind of thing together of bits of Zoom workshops that I've done of people getting imagery like that. So maybe if you remind me, I can show it later or I can do it now. It's up to you.
oh, sure. I just had a couple more questions, if it's all right. So I would like to thank a great valued member of our community, Michelle, for sending me this. Thank you, Michelle. But do you have any, by any chance, have you placed any of these
Organite.
organites around the water before the process, during, after? And if so, have you found any results, or have you maybe even felt anything energetically that's different as if it wasn't there?
Hmm. I mean, organite, especially organite pyramids, do make a noticeable structural change. I was fortunate enough to, when I had that wellness center I told you about, which had that pyramid structure in it,
Right.
a man brought over this huge organite pyramid that he had made, and he made incredible ones. And so it was a really overcast day. So we put that pyramid, that organite pyramid, in my pyramid, which was inside a building. And then he said, "Now come outside and watch." And literally, we watched a circle appear in the clouds, and we could just see this little bit of blue sky in this perfect circle right above where the organite pyramid was. And pyramids amplify things about 108 times. So its energy was being amplified through my pyramid, and then we could literally see this hole open, which was pretty amazing. So on a structural level, yes, I've definitely seen a positive change.
You said
Um,
pyramids amplify things by 108 times?
yeah. Now, when I worked within that pyramid, I learned a lot of things about myself, and I learned a lot of things about pyramids purely by being in them. Some interesting stuff happened because I had all kinds of people come and see me, and you'd be surprised actually how many people want to come and have an experience like in a pyramid, because it's not something not that many people offer. And so I had a few people come over with their compasses, because after it had been sitting there for a year, you could literally walk in it and hear this high-pitched sound. And it was like literally everybody could hear it. It was like you were up high in a mountain or something, or your ears were slightly ringing, or it was just a really interesting kind of sound. And so I observed something myself, and then other people came to try it. And so you can, some people had a physical compass, and some people had the compasses on their phone. And the compasses, you could all be in the room, and all the compasses basically showed a different reading. They were completely off near the pyramid. We walked back and back and back, walked all the way up the road till we got to the school. And then finally the compass reading became normal. And it was really interesting how it affected the compass. But it's interesting how it affected the water. And some of the things that happened in there were so unusual. I had someone, someone staying with me, and they didn't really know much about pyramids. And she and her partner were in the new stages of their relationship, and he was having to go away, and they were really sad about that. And so for some reason they decided to go into the pyramid, which is in a separate house from my house, but very close together. And pyramids are naturally, they just make things cold. So, and they make things exceptionally cold when you're not supposed to be in them. And I observed that there are different places where if you lie in a certain direction, that's the direction for healing. And if you lie in the opposite direction, that's what I termed as the death position. Not that you're going to die, but more, I think it helped to get, you would become so cold it was intolerable to stay there. And so they had gone into the pyramid. They didn't have the heater on, they didn't have the light on, they didn't have anything like that. They didn't want to move anything, but they didn't know much about it. And so both of them were in there, and as I said, pyramids amplify things, and so good and bad, with no judgment on either.
Right.
And so they were having this experience of really being sad. Anyway, long story short, this person comes running into the room, and she said, something's happened to her partner. You've got to come. I'm like, well, where is he? In the pyramid. Is he cold? Yes. Oh my God. I knew before it happened what was probably going on. So I went in there, and her partner is in the death position. His legs are up like this, and he's like a EMT guy. He helps. He's very practical, working within the hospital and the ambulance.
Sure.
And he's like, I don't know what's happening to me. I can't put my legs down. I was lying here, and then I've got freezing, and now my legs are sticking up, and I can't put them down, and I'm freaking out. I'm like, whoa, my God. So we moved him, and into a different position. I turned the heater on. I started doing reflexology on him, and he managed to get his legs back down again. And he's like, what the hell happened? And I jokingly said, well, if I'd left you long enough, the other part of you would have lifted up. You would have started levitating out of here. But I don't think he thought that was
it? But
funny.
just to clarify, was it the position of that specific location within the pyramid he just so happened to go to that he shouldn't have, in your
Yeah,
opinion? Right.
yeah. No, some odd stuff. But it also is the preserving space. So I suspect that even bodies within the pyramids were probably positioned a certain way, because it does make something happen, something really interesting. This coldness happens, and I think it's for preservation, it probably helps preserve the body.
Right. And not to put you on the spot, if you don't know off the top of your head, no problem. But when you said that pyramids amplify energy or things by 108 times, may I ask what tool you use to measure that? And I ask this because with speaking to my audience here, interestingly enough, when we've delved into sort of the elite financial structure of things, I have to say, Vita, again, not to be a tinfoil hat person, but the number 1.8, 1.08, whether it's in their money transfers, things like this, seems to constantly be, reoccurring. And I don't think I need to explain to you that, again, I don't think it's a coincidence these very, very wealthy people have, the eye of Ra, Horus, very, into those things, and all of that. But yes, if I may ask, what tool was used to get to that 108?
Well, there were two things that got me to that point. One was that the man who made the pyramid, he's an incredible carpenter. And so he actually made his own house into this pyramid, which was covered in this whole layer of quartz. It took him 10.5 years to build. And so he was like so huge into pyramids. And he was showing me, I don't actually know his whole method. It was quite a long time ago as well. But he was the one first to introduce that 108 times of amplification. But as I was working within that pyramid, so I mean, some people talk a lot about there being this kind of record, this Akashic record perhaps, and that could be certainly held within the water. And an interesting thing happened to me quite a few years ago now. And it was when I had just started working with the pyramid. And so it was like about 10 years ago. And I was just going, like the day before, I took my son out and we went out for dinner together. And I came home and I felt like I was high up on top of a mountain, like it felt like my ears were slightly blocked. And I thought that was kind of strange because I don't usually have anything going on with my ears. And then I went to bed, and the next day I felt okay. I got the children to school. I kind of did everything I needed to do, got into the house, and then I started to feel really strange. And I collapsed. I couldn't feel my legs, and I was stuttering. It felt like my throat was swelling up. I managed to push redial on my phone because I'd rung the doctor because I was already starting to feel a bit weird. And I said, look, I'm feeling a bit weird. My ears are feeling weird, because they started to come back in that feeling, after I got up. And so they made me an appointment for an hour or two later. So I pushed redial and I just managed to tell them that I was not doing good. They came over, the ambulance came over. Because I'd had showers of blood clots in my lungs from a prior accident years ago, where we went under a 7-ton truck and rolled twice, and the driver was actually decapitated. It was considered one of the worst accidents in New Zealand where someone survived. And that kind of was part of the reason that also led me on to the discovery around water and healthy water, and I had a healing experience with that. But essentially, they tested me and they thought I might be having some kind of stroke. But they did all the tests and they said, no, you actually seem to be fine. We think you're having a type of migraine. And so I was like, I hate being in hospital. I want to get out of here. So I went home and they said, if any problem happens, just call us back. The next day I was stuttering again. So I went back to hospital and they did these different tests on me. And they did this x-ray of my chest and they kept doing it. And I've already had this twice now. Why do you need to do it again? But they had an x-ray of my heart from my car accident and all these different operations that I've had. I've had 8 surgeries because of that. And they was like, we don't understand what's happening because your heart appears to be enlarged to such a degree. It's actually as if it's a man's heart, like someone larger than me's heart is actually in your body. It is not just enlarged through stress or these kinds of things. This is so strange. And I basically didn't want to be in hospital anymore, and intuitively I knew I'd be okay. And I ended up just not wanting to become this guinea pig. And I went home, and none of those strange things happened to me again, except for the fact that I started to write about things I had no prior knowledge of, and I started to be able to see energy around all living things. And I really thought I'd lost. I thought, oh my God, I'm going crazy. I started to write about stuff that just didn't seem to make any sense. I started to write about things like how pyramids were used for all different types of things, and different stones meant different things that they were made with. And one of them was where they made these vats. They had these vats made of this special stone. Inside they were completely saturated salt water, so the water couldn't absorb any more salt like in the Dead Sea. And people would come up through these tunnels that came up through the ground, and they would, these highly advanced people, and they put their hands literally in the water together until they heard this kind of crackling sound. And then they would take them out and they would leave. And that energy buildup would start to form something of which looked a lot like lightning on top of the water. And this lightning, I could literally see it, and they would know how long to leave their hands in forward for the build-up of energy, which would then eventually build the energy up so much that this capstone would flip off, and there'd be a beam of light that would come up through the pyramid, and that would be used for various different things. And so I was like, okay, lightning on water, what the hell is all this about? I wrote a lot of stuff, all about platonic solids and all kinds of things. And so I started to get what I termed as Googleitis. I Googled everything I was like writing. And I started to get confirmation. This date matches in with this event, this and this and this, all tied in. And so I started to research, and there was this man that was searching for a cure for cancer. And he had some kind of electromagnetic wave that went through into a salt solution. And there was that lightning bolt thing I was talking about. And I'm like, I know this is real. And so within that, I started to write about a lot of different things that have happened in the past. I even wrote all about junk DNA and all kinds of stuff. It was like I ended up writing a whole book for a whole year, and I barely slept that whole year. And I called it Soul Archaeology, which I've never published because I was actually warned not to. I was warned not to because and so I haven't. I won't get into that too much. But anyway,
if I could just say very quickly, there are people that I've researched over the years, whether still alive or not, in which are told things to them, whether in their dreams or after an unfortunate physical experience, and they know things, they'll write it down, and then their work will start gaining traction, and then they'll be told, no, this can't get out.
Yeah.
Wow.
But anyway, that 108 thing was one of the things that it's a sort of really long-winded story to say why the 108 came up. I wrote about it, and I wrote about an experience that I clearly remembered about being and working in pyramids. And as an interesting side note about that, I mentioned that I took my son out for dinner. Every Wednesday I'd take him out for dinner. And I think he was like about 10 at the time. And so he was he's a very practical boy. He's lovely, but very black and white in lots of ways. Open to a lot of stuff, but likes to be able to seeing is believing kind of person. But I do remember I had just written something for this book around Atlantis. And I had written about this pyramid that was there, and about this other structure behind it. And I'd written about how I went into the pyramid because my job was to be in that pyramid. I was the only person. I never hardly even left that pyramid. My job was to heal people and work with this technology that was in there. And I had written that I saw one thing in the pyramid. So I took my son out for dinner, and he asked me what I'm doing. I said, I'm just writing about Atlantis. And this is the only time this has ever happened to him, I have to say. He probably has tried to block it out because it freaked him out after he said this. He said to me, I remember that. I said, what do you remember? He said, no, I remember I was a builder there. I worked in Atlantis. And I'm like, you do know what I mean, eh? Like,
Right.
just,
Yes.
he's a little boy. And he's like, no, I do. He even his demeanor, everything changed. And even the way he spoke, I said, oh, well, what do you remember? He said, oh, we would always walk down this long path thing, and then there was this statue on the left, and then there was this kind of pyramid, and then behind that was this obelisk shape, and inside of that obelisk shape, he drew me the obelisk. He said inside that was this giant crystal, and that crystal was what was generating the energy of where we lived. And he said that one day the tectonic plates moved, and it pushed that crystal off balance, and so everything just kind of stopped working, and all of these people, the elder people, went in and were trying to rectify things. He said he wasn't allowed to go in there because he was a builder, but then he said he then had to have something to do with it because they were trying to reconstruct something. Anyway, he said he went. I said, do you remember what was in the pyramid? Because all the while I'm thinking, God, I just wrote about this. This is freaky. And he said, oh, there's only one thing in the pyramid. I'm like, what? I'm like, well, what is it? He said it's this kind of thing that looks like a wooden bed. He said it's not wood though. He said it's still around. He said it can't be destroyed. It just happens to look like wood. He said above it are these lights that are kind of just suspended. And I'm like floored because that's what I had written. And he said that those lights are used for healing. And that the person would lie on this bed would have a certain type of frequency that helped to realign that person's health. And so I wrote about, in this writing, I wrote about how the Atlanteans would actually, when they were pregnant, and he even said, our people don't breed very often. And he also said, before I get into what I wrote, he also said that he started going into the we. He said, I could tell you where it is. I know where it is. He said, but we don't. Then he went into this whole kind of, almost his whole body started to change in his demeanor. And he said, but we don't want anyone to find it yet. It's not the right time. He said, it's still sunk. He said, but if you could move that crystal into the right place, Atlantis will rise again. And so as we're going home, driving home, he said, Mum, I don't know what happened to me, but I don't want to talk about that anymore. Can we just talk about soccer? I'm like, okay, let's talk about soccer. But what I wrote in regards to pyramids and Atlantis, and that in the very, very early stages, I said that the Atlantean people were at a very high frequency, and they didn't breed very often. Children were very much intentional. And so when a child was conceived, there was a priestess who would listen to the heartbeat of that child, and that there was a crystal that was made specifically dedicated and around the frequency of their heartbeat, and they could gauge all the information they needed to know about that child's physical, emotional, spiritual body from its heartbeat. And so those crystals were held and kept around their necks for their whole lives. And if anything ever went wrong with their body, that crystal was able to be put into this particular technology, which would then be able to read all the information of their body and health and actually help to heal them. But I had written that over time, and this relates into water, and over a long time, there was aliens, like extraterrestrials or other entities perhaps, who wanted to come to Earth and had to find a way. They were very attracted to Atlantis and to that frequency, to that area. And I've often, in the book, I wrote about it as being like what kind of clock? Like an atomic clock. Like if you hear about Atlantis being like there's rings around it, and the center there was a water wheel actually that moved water, and the water held a lot of information. But if you got the middle and you move those rings around it, it is an atom. And so anyway, I wrote about this, and they figured out they needed to be born into society. So they were able to then, these twins were born and got into the belly of this woman called Halima, and so this priestess who looks after the pregnant woman, and all the women would bear their children in this birthing pyramid. And so Halima had already seen, no, that was the woman, this other woman, I can't remember her name now, sorry. She would go and she would listen to the heartbeat of the children inside of Halima, but she couldn't find a frequency that would match any of the crystals, and they kept breaking. And so she had to go with a very, very kind of common denominator frequencies just so they wouldn't break. And she'd already foreseen what would happen. And she said that she didn't want to scare anyone, so she didn't tell Halima what was going on. She just tried to prevent it. So when she attuned that crystal, it made the children forget. It kind of gave them an amnesia. And so by the time they were 6, they ended up going into the waters. There was one area of water in Atlantis that people were not supposed to bathe in or go in. So they were children, they went in, and they remembered everything of why they were there, and their crystals turned black and they had to hide them. And so then they began learning super fast, and then they got married very early, started breeding as fast as they could. And what happened was that they were shifting and changing this frequency that was amongst the people. And there was a scientist, even back then, there was a man called H20 who was a scientist, and this was well after they'd become very, very predominant, and Atlantis was starting to, quote unquote, fall with this, what would be termed as this ego frequency. And so this scientist, H20, was able to like measure frequency of ego. I'm just using that word because I can't think of the right word.
Right.
And so he had this device to measure it, and he observed that people, when they went into the sea and they came out, it would be gone for 10 minutes. That frequency would not be there. And so he started trying to create devices and ways in which, like these salt rubs to give to people, to give them relief from this kind of energy. But there were still some Atlanteans that didn't want a bar of what was going on, and they understood, and they had kept away from that, and they wouldn't have children. And so they ended up spending more and more and more time in the sea. And that is then what leads you into this concept of mer people. And so people that have evolved and adapted to, and they could, because their frequency was so different than ours now. And so they were able to adapt to spend a long time in the ocean. But there was this king, ruler kind of guy who wanted to annihilate all good. And so he sent his people out to go and catch those beings, and he would pen them into this area where they'd still be in the ocean, but they couldn't go any further.
Do you happen to recall what his eyes look like?
No.
No.
I
Okay.
didn't
Sorry.
write about that.
Okay.
But
Sorry.
I remember saying that he would feed them people, and they would die, or they would have to eat the food, the meat. And so over time and breeding, they became known that they were hunters. And so then he would release them so that they could go and hunt the other beings that were out there just to avoid all of this. And that then brings into this concept of why the sirens and the mermaid, these people that would be there to entice the sailors and then like eat them and kill them. It always seems so different than what the idea of a mermaid really would be. And so it was actually very traumatic and very awful what happened in that whole process. And so I guess that then ties into a short story I'll tell you. I'll try to condense it because I know we've been a long time.
Sorry, if you don't mind, if you could just hold on to that thought for a second. I just wanted to say, both for you and to the audience as well, when they will be watching or listening to this, up until the what I've been known to call the Dyson sphere, which is what you said looked like an atom in Atlantis, that spinning water clock, if you will. I've been getting goosebumps since the moment you started telling the story. Your son, I know we don't know each other, but your son is the third person I've come across in my life who said the exact same thing.
Oh,
It
I just got total goosebumps too.
identical, identical. Yep. And
Wow.
yeah, this is also, if I may add as well, uh, in my own research, I have found as well there have allegedly been hidden documents from World War II, which I'm sure there's loads of all kinds, but one of them specifically had to do with Hitler's mentor discussing memories from Atlantis, and they're also exactly as what you're describing. So I just wanted to say, as well, pertaining to 108, I did a quick search, and it seems as though that we see here the weight of the pyramid in Egypt, I'm not sure which one, is estimated at 5.9 million tons, just over that. You multiply that number by 10 to the power of 8, and it gives you the estimate of the Earth's mass. 108 also represents the sun's radius, and it also has to do with Metatron's cube, if I'm not mistaken. It also is the number of degrees between the top arms of the pentagram. So again, I think it's what you said. It's not, it doesn't judge. It's just whichever, however it is used, if that makes sense. But if you will, with this story, I'm so intrigued. By the way, thank you for your time.
Of course. I mean, I'm still getting comfortable sharing what I'm going to share now.
Sure, sure.
But it is something that the lady that's filming me wants me to share because it does tie in a lot of things with me and the work with water that I do. So, firstly, I was born with rather unusual eye lenses. So, we have an eyelid like this, and then we have our eye lens. But when I was born, I had an eye lens that went on top of that actually moved like this, and they were see-through, like clear. And my mother didn't want me to become a science experiment, and she basically decided that they should be removed when I was just a tiny baby. And so for a long time my eyes didn't heal, and I was essentially, they thought potentially I might even be blind. But over time I started to be able to see. When I was 5, they started to come back. I remember I just started school, and I had to have surgery again. And this time it took even longer for my eyes to heal. And so I started to actually learn Braille. And I started to realize that I could see things in the dark. Like with your eyes, when you can't see, you can see other things. And so, without going into that for too much, then they never started to come back. They never came back. And so then going forward, when I was just before I was 14, I used to ride horses a lot. And my friend's dad had taken us out riding, and he was taking the horses back. And my friend and I ran down to the beach because we got to the dunes, and we went down to the beach. We were hot, and we went and we just kind of splash around in the ocean. But I wasn't that familiar with that beach, and I went out a little far, and it got really deep quite suddenly. And then I'm swimming, and then I feel something around my ankle, and that's the last thing I remember. And then the next thing I remember is being resuscitated, and my body had been missing for 3 hours. And if I had drowned for 3 hours, I wouldn't be here speaking to you. So something else had happened. And so I remember kind of coming around, and after being sick and stuff, and looking up at the clouds, and everyone, all these faces were looking at me, but I remember just kind of, they were a blur, and just looking up and watching the clouds. Everything seemed like it was in slow motion. And then when I was taken to hospital, my mum came, and she told me that a few hundred meters up the beach, 2 dolphins had been found dead, and they were slashed. And when I heard about that, I literally couldn't speak for like about a week. I felt so traumatized. It wasn't like what happened to me, it didn't even matter. But I felt like those dolphins were helping me in some way, and that they had been hurt because of me. And I felt so terrible. And so I blocked that memory out. And
Wow.
I didn't want to like talk about it. I never really shared it. Very, very few people even know about it. That have known me a long time. And so a few years ago, someone I told that story to for the first time in a long time. Both the things about the eyes and that drowning. And so I went back into a hypnotherapy regression kind of a session. And I was recorded. And so I listened to that recording because when I came back out of that, I still had amnesia. I didn't want to remember what was going on. And so what I said in the beginning when I was born with those eyes was that those eyes were two things. One is that I was always supposed to see in the water, but also I was able to see the world without the veil. So when I was in that stage, when I remember having them, I remembered seeing worlds within worlds and colors that I can't even explain, and
That are,
that,
sorry, colors that are not on our spectrum.
yeah, there's no words for them. And I would see, like, it literally was like I could see bubbles, and inside the bubble there was like another world and another world and another world. There was just nothing to prevent you from seeing the everything. And then you were able to focus in just on one small thing, and within that there was so much. And there was like this feeling, there was a sound that was so silent that you there was like, I can't even explain it. Silence and sound, they almost don't go together, but they did. Like there was just it was a different type of place. And so when I had that taken away, it took me a very, very long time to adapt to being in this body, in this world, in this dimension. Everything, the veil was there. But I was very, very sick as a child, and my body just had not adapted well, and I had to have 3 blood transfusions by around about 1. And apparently my mum told me I had some gifts as well, and that she'd come in to look at me in my crib, and my room didn't, there was no, the window wasn't open and nothing was happening, and I'd be looking at the windmill, like the dangly thing, and it would be moving around, and just little things I won't get into. There were, I don't think I should talk about everything, but anyway, so I said about that this idea that we're only really just we're just such a veil away. It's just such a thin layer. And so then I said that when I drowned, what pulled me down was the person. I don't even know what to call him. I guess
Mermaid?
kind of like a man, but I didn't see the below his body. So when I was pulled down, he had like a bioluminescence. So my eyes were open and shut, open and shut. I could sort of see his face. And he felt like my brother. He felt like a relative. And I could see the confusion on his face. He was just, I could hear his thoughts. He was asking, why are you drowning? He didn't understand, because I was supposedly not supposed to be exactly like I am now. I was supposed to be able to live and see in the water and not drown. And he was so confused. But when he realized what was happening, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. But I felt that there were 2 more behind me. And so my body was put into a state of suspension, and my subtle body was taken on a journey. and I was taken through this vortex, that vortex so fast that it was very much like that silence and sound feeling like I just talked about before. And I ended up kind of like coming up, and in this subtle body, I was lying on my back on the ocean, looking up at all these lights. And this person is asking me, okay, so where are you? You know, what date is it? And it was the same date. I can't remember off the top of my head what it is now. But I could give you that information. I just need to go back and listen to it. But anyway, I said that I had come out to the Hudson River in New York. And that it was nighttime, and that the lights were a ship that was specifically attracted to me. And it felt really nice. I didn't feel scared or any of those kinds of things. But I wasn't even in this physical form. And so I'm lying there looking up, and the lights, there's quite a few of them in a sort of circular shape, and they have a kind of a energy wave. And that energy wave is kind of like, it's invisible, but you can feel it touching you. And it's almost starting to like scoop me up. But then where there's a lot of light, there's often, it attracts good and bad. And so I said that I was somehow told telepathically that I wasn't safe. Well, it's not that I wasn't safe from the lights and all of that. It was something that was through the water. And so I was then pulled back down this vortex thing, but there were 3 dolphins, I said. And I said that one dolphin managed to make it and escort me back through this vortex, and 2 stayed behind to protect me. And they didn't make it. And they came back out through that vortex and were washed up on the beach. Then my body my subtle body went straight back into my body that was being held in suspension. And then I breathed for the first time, and I started to drown. And then my body was found after it started to float. And whether that was a near-death experience, and that was like what I saw, or whether that was real, the interesting part is that the person that was doing that ended up Googling like sightings on that date near the Hudson River, and it came out with one of the largest sightings of a UFO that as many people had seen. And so what actually really happened there, I can't explain it, really.
If I could just say first and foremost, thank you from the bottom of my heart, and from also on behalf of my audience and our Patreon supporters and all of that, for even being willing to share that with us. What I will say, and I'm not saying that simply because I'm conversing with you now, I am in full belief of your story, because I mean, some of the intricate details that you're explaining as you have been telling your story is identical to what astrophysicists, we even have one that comes on the show here, has been talking about with respects to he has a theory that the universe is not expanding or contracting, our perception is, and it's all about the macro and the micro, and it seems to describe exactly what you're saying there. In addition to that, I mean, to be wow, just I mean, thank you so very much. That is, it may, I don't know where to start with respects to why I believe you. And not only, I mean, I feel as though intuitively of course you're telling the truth, but at the same time, if I were to use sort of like, okay, let's compare it to so and so and what have, wow, it's, I mean, yeah.
I feel like I spend a lot of my life really not wanting to be different. That's why, like, I've never drunk alcohol, I've never had cigarette, I've never done any kind of recreational drugs. The only drugs I've ever had is from the car accident. I told my mother I wouldn't eat meat at 8. I've lived this really holistic life, but I've also never wanted to, like, particularly stand out. And so when I started working with pyramids and had that wellness center, it was the first time I felt confident that I was going to give it a try, to be able to be more in alignment with who I was, but also to be able to feel like I'm accepted in some way, doing something a little bit different. So one of the big changes for me, though, was that when I started working in the pyramid, I have gifts of this kind of a electrical. I'm one of those people that gives a lot of people electric shocks by accident, and so
Usually that's a good sign, by the way.
but I worked on people, so I called it electrical acupuncture. I could see their energy where it was blocked, and I would just touch their body and be able to kind of move energy through. The last person I ever treated came to me, and I was starting to get some of the gifts I had back, because I think when you're working in these pyramids, things happen to you. And so anyway, she lay down, and you know when you hear like an electric fence, and that has that sound? So I heard that sound, and I literally I felt like I was frozen, but I couldn't help it. My hands were behind her head, on her neck, and this current went through my fingers and literally gave her this electrical shock. And me and her both kind of like got a little bit of that, but she stood up, literally her hair was standing up on end, and she looked at me like I was the devil and left. And I stopped it. I stopped it all. I stopped doing it. I went super sciencey. I just didn't engage in any of that anymore.
Right.
I swung completely the other way, because my biggest thing is I never wanted to hurt anybody. And she made me feel like my mother had always said, you know, you're just super special, but we don't want to share a lot of this because not everyone's going to see it that way. And so I really felt awful. And then I swung back into some balance, because we're water, we come back into balance sooner or later. And now I'm more confident of talking about these experiences, but also sharing the work that I do.
Right.
And seeing the pictures that I get. But when other people can do it too.
Right.
You know, there is a message from a far greater place coming through this work. You know, it's no coincidence that water is speaking in this language. I've always felt this really sad sense of responsibility to the being that I saw in the ocean. Like I was supposed to be with them, or sharing with the world something important they had to say.
Right.
And so this language of water that I'm seeing as it freezes, I believe will give them an opportunity to also speak and be sort of heard in a way, and not have to hide all the time. And when I said to water two things, I said, can you show me who I spoke to in that day that showed me the person, that image? And I also said, can you show me who saved me? And the dolphin is literally coming through this circle that looks like a vortex. And so it's, for me, I mean,
If I may ask, the image of that humanoid, did it look mermaid like as we know it to be, particularly the bottom half? And yeah,
it shows the face with this kind of detail up here, this kind of fin thing.
Oh my gosh.
And then, but then it only goes to part of the torso, and maybe because I couldn't see it, it didn't show me the bottom half. So I can privately send that to you so you can see it if you want.
If I could say, and I have no, my audience knows I have no shame in saying, I believe that mermaids, whatever we would like to call them as, again, that's just a label that we've in the English language has given it. I certainly believe they're real. And I say this because, believe it or not, Vita, I have to be careful saying on the record, we could talk more after, but there are people from the Navy that are like, this is real. This is very real. And this has been going on for years and years and years, even before World War II. I've spoken, I got, sorry, we'll talk more about that afterwards. But I did want to say as well too, though, if I may, have you heard by chance, there's been this new classification, particularly from the New Zealand, Australian, Israeli, and American militaries, they're now classifying a difference between maritime and deep sea. And it's interesting because I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the ocean within the ocean. There's
Mm-hmm.
actually a, yes, and dolphins, amongst a few others, can actually go through this sort of force field. It's like a dome seen within very bottom parts of the ocean, of the surface. And humans, when trying to walk through it, they end up dying or getting dizzy or vomiting. It's very nauseous, but dolphins can swim through it no problem. I couldn't help but think of that. But if I may, before wrapping up, I did want to, if it's all right, since you've been so kind to share a story of your own, if I may share a quick one of mine. I think people in our Patreon community know, a few of them know about this, but it has to do with my great grandfather, actually, in Italy. My background is Italian, and my grandparents and their parents grew up in the mountains of Italy, on a farm, typical European, World War II era, that whole thing. And there was one time where they lived in a small town, maybe 700 people. And my great grandfather used to take a horse and buggy across a bridge every day to go, something to do with the farm or whatever. And long story short, there was one day where the horse literally, as they were crossing the bridge, there were two horses, and the horses slipped off the bridge, which already was like very strange. And then the buggy fell with it, and my great grandfather thought, okay, this is it, I'm gonna die. And I know this is gonna sound, maybe not to you, but to some, the two horses and my great grandfather, just as they're falling, they just stopped. And then, as if something of my great grandfather described, the closest thing to what he felt was not like a giant picked him up, it was more like a magnetic force stopped him, like a magnet, and lifted him and the two horses up back onto the bridge. And what ended up happening, and then he went on his way, and he was freaking out. He didn't speak for days. Not about that, he just didn't talk for days. Long story short, there was a priest who came, the town priest came to look into it, and the priest said, I need to go get someone from outside of town who specializes in this stuff, which, again, back then the Catholic Church didn't allow that. It was a muddy area, right? They said no exorcist, all that kind of stuff. And so I believe a medium psychic of some sort showed up and said, you weren't saved because you were meant to be. There were elves eating under that bridge in another dimension, and you were, I know it's going to sound silly, the medium said to my great grandfather, you sir, and your horses were about to fall on top of their dinner table, literally. And they're in another dimension, but they have enough of an ability to see ours, see into ours rather. And they just didn't like the idea that even if they weren't going to feel it physically, you and your horses were going to come into their spot. So they said, okay, so they lifted you up and put you back on the bridge. So make of that as,
I
yeah.
have something to add to that. There's a book called Supernatural by Graham Hancock that
Right. Mm-hmm.
my partner's been reading. And because my daughter so loves fairies and things like that, but he was reading about how that is common practice. If you come too close to where they're doing something specific, there is this, they will literally like throw you out.
Right.
Throw you out. And so there's been different, he talks about it in some depth. So I would suggest that might be another thing to revisit that could actually support that.
For
So,
sure.
I mean, it's hard for us to imagine a lot of things, but
It's so
I'll
true. Yeah.
say that my grandmother, she was in, so she basically had a really interesting thing happen where I was told this by my mum. So on my mum's 8th birthday, her mother had got remarried and was going on her honeymoon. And they went to Barbados. They were going to Barbados. And so she was on a flight called the Star Aerial. And that flight went down over the Bermuda Triangle and was never found again. And so I never met my grandmother, but when I was growing up, I used to have this imagining that she was somehow in this other world and other realm, and I would see her again sometime, and that she wasn't really dead. And so a lot of interesting things have happened, and when we go into our history as well and our ancestors, one thing I heard, which I think is really interesting, because we may not think to ask our parents this question, was saying that if you don't know what your parents really wanted for their lives, what their kind of more global dream was, then you're always going to have some little part of you missing. It's really important to know what your parents really wanted. And we don't often think to ask them that question. So when they pass, there is this passing on, the search within us that we don't understand. But if we understand what they have always really wanted, not for us, not about us, but for the what they feel about the world, what they would like to see, what they think their contribution really is, or was, or what they want to achieve. I
That's
think it's
big.
very interesting.
That because that's a very good point, because I mean, even on the physical side, that the lack of transparency from parents sadly tends to breed both great kids. Some say, I don't want to grow up being like that. Others don't, think outside of that box and become even worse than their parents. Wow, that's a really good point. I truthfully, Veda, I would love to chat more, but it's coming up to 3 hours. I have another
Oh my God.
obligation. No, it's been fantastic. The audience is going to love this. Absolutely. I would like to say though, if you could tell everyone where and how they can find you, your website, social media, all of that, because I encourage everyone to check out Veda's work. I mean, it's undeniable, truly. So
Sure. So my website's my name, which is vedaaustin.com. I post daily on Instagram, which is VedaAustin_water, and on Facebook it's Veda Austin at Water Researcher. And anyone can just download my technique to learn it for themselves, or you can hop on a workshop. And I always recommend getting the guide, the step-by-step guide with the hydroglyphs, because that way you're going to be able to not just see patterns or designs, but water might actually want to communicate with you in a different way through this kind of language. So, yeah.
that's fantastic. And thank you so much, everybody, for listening and watching to this very, very special conversation. And we will catch you all next time.